Across oceans, jungles and mountains, airplanes have vanished without a trace. Some after a final radio call, others in complete silence.
I can't see anything. Please, it's crashing. Goodbye, everybody.
Each disappearance left behind fragments of sound, coordinates on a map, and questions that have never been answered. These are the stories of 21 flights that took off, sent one last message, and were never seen again. Late Coair 300, Croix-du-Sud. Jean Mermoz, 1936, South Atlantic. We've shut down the rear right engine. That was the last message ever received from the Late Coair 300, Croix-du-Sud. The voice on the radio belonged to Jean Mermoz, one of France's most celebrated aviators. Minutes later, the signal faded. The sky over the South Atlantic went silent. It was December 7th, 1936. The aircraft had left Dakar, Senegal early that morning, bound for Natal, Brazil. It was part of the Air France mail service, a bold line connecting Europe to South America across thousands of kilometres of open ocean. The crew had flown this route many times before, but on this flight, the first sign of trouble came before they even left the ground. During the initial takeoff attempt, one of the engines had misfired. Mechanics worked quickly, cleaned filters and checked pressures. The problem seemed fixed. Mermoz, never one to delay a mission, ordered another departure. At 6:43 a.m, the flying boat lifted again, heavy with mail and fuel, heading west into the long Atlantic morning. For the first few hours, everything was normal. The aircraft reported steady progress. Tailwinds moderate, conditions favourable. Then, somewhere around the halfway point, came that short, calm transmission. The aft-starboard engine had been shut down, and after that, nothing. The Croix-du-Sud was no ordinary plane. It was a massive 4-engine seaplane built for distance. 2 engines were mounted in tandem on each wing, one pulling, one pushing. It was a design that worked, but with risks. If one of the rear pusher engines failed, the spinning propeller was dangerously close to the aircraft's structure. A mechanical failure there could turn catastrophic in seconds. Those words, "shut down the rear right engine," were not a distress call. They were calm and procedural, suggesting the crew believed they could manage the problem. Flying on 3 engines wasn't unusual for long-range seaplanes, but after that brief message, no follow-up came, no mayday, no static bursts, just silence over the South Atlantic. Jean Mermoz was a national hero, almost a legend in his own lifetime. Known as L'Archange, he had opened new routes across Africa, the Andes, and the Atlantic. He was confident, experienced, and trusted by his crew. Alongside him were 4 men: co-pilot Alexandre Pichardou, navigator Henri Ezen, flight engineer Jean Lavidali, and radio operator Edgar Creveler. Together they formed one of the most seasoned teams in early aviation. When the radio went quiet, Dakar began calling back, hoping for a reply. Hours passed. Other aircraft were launched to search along the expected route, but there was no sign of the Croix-du-Sud. The sea was calm that day, the weather clear, conditions that should have favoured a rescue, yet the ocean showed nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no floating mail bags. The plane and its 5 men had vanished completely. Investigators could only work from theory. Some believed the failed engine may have torn free from its mount or shed a propeller blade, slicing into the tail or the hull. On a flying boat, a breach below the waterline would cause an immediate loss of buoyancy if they tried to ditch. Others suspected the crew may have attempted to turn back toward Africa and simply run out of fuel before reaching land. Every explanation remained uncertain because there was no physical evidence, not even a scrap of metal. Mermoz's decision to press on after the first engine trouble became a focal point. But in 1936, the mail schedule was sacred. Aviation was both business and national pride. The South Atlantic route was still relatively new, and Mermoz had pioneered it. To turn back again would have meant grounding one of France's proudest achievements. For him, the risk might have seemed worth it. In the absence of wreckage, small details took on weight. Reports came from ships that had seen faint oil patches days later. None could be confirmed. The official investigation ended with a simple conclusion: aircraft lost at sea, cause unknown. Over time, the Croix-du-Sud became more than a missing aircraft. It became a symbol. Mermoz's disappearance marked the end of the romantic era of pioneering flight across the Atlantic. After him, the skies belonged less to lone adventurers and more to fleets and systems. The technical story, though, is still studied today. The late Courier 300 had flown dozens of successful crossings before that day. It had been designed for endurance and had performed as promised. But even a single mechanical failure in the middle of an ocean could undo everything. Long-range flight was still an experiment, a balance of faith, precision, and weather. On board, the men would have known the exact odds they faced. If the engine had failed cleanly, they could continue on 3. If it had caused damage to the wing or tail, control would be compromised. A slow turn back toward Africa might have been attempted, or a descent for an emergency landing on the water. But the South Atlantic is no friendly surface. Even light waves can shatter a hull during landing. Once on the ocean, with no radio contact and limited daylight, survival would depend entirely on how long the aircraft stayed afloat. For the search teams, the task was almost impossible. In those days, there was no radar coverage, no emergency beacons, no black boxes. The only guide was time and fuel. Each hour extended the uncertainty. The search grids widened, then faded into the endless blue. In France, the loss hit hard. Jean Mermoz had been more than a pilot. He was a symbol of courage and exploration, a man who made flight seem noble. News of his disappearance spread fast. Air France grounded the route temporarily. Pilots who had flown with him described him as calm, steady, unafraid. No one believed he had taken unnecessary risks, yet everyone knew that flying the Atlantic was never safe. The name Croix-du-Sud, the Southern Cross, seemed prophetic. It was the constellation sailors used to guide them across the southern seas, a symbol of direction and faith. Now it became a memorial, marking a place on the map that would never be found. All that remains of that day are the few lines of radio log, the weather charts, and the legend that grew around Mermoz's last flight. Somewhere in those 4 hours between Dakar and silence, the Atlantic took one of the greatest pilots of his generation, and an aircraft that had carried the pride of a nation. The water closed over both, leaving behind only that final message drifting in static. We've shut down the rear right engine. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan, Lockheed Electra, 1937, Central Pacific. The morning of July 2nd, 1937 began like many others in Amelia Earhart's world. Calm, organised, and filled with purpose. She was already one of the most famous aviators alive, the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic, and now she was attempting something no one had done before, a flight around the world close to the equator. By this point, she and her navigator, Fred Noonan, had already covered nearly 35,000 kilometres. Only one long stretch remained, the most dangerous one, across the Pacific, from Lae in Papua New Guinea to Howland Island, a tiny speck of land in the middle of endless ocean. The aircraft was a Lockheed Electra 10E, a twin-engine monoplane modified for long-range flight. Its aluminum skin shone silver in the morning sun as it sat on the tarmac in Lae. Extra fuel tanks filled most of the cabin, giving the plane a range of about 4,000 kilometres, just enough to reach Howland if everything went right. The US Coast Guard cutter Itasca was already stationed near the island, ready to provide radio guidance. At 10 a.m. local time, Earhart and Noonan took off. The Electra climbed slowly under its heavy load, clearing the hills and turning east toward the horizon. The weather forecast was mostly good, though some reports warned of scattered storms and cloud banks along the route. Communication would be vital. The Itasca crew was briefed to maintain constant radio contact, guiding the aircraft toward the island with signals and bearings. As the hours passed, fragments of radio messages came through. At 2:18 a.m. Howland time, the Itasca received a faint call. Cloudy weather, light rain. The signal was strong enough to confirm that the aircraft was approaching, but Earhart's transmissions were on a frequency that the ship could hear, while she could not hear the replies. This one-way communication would soon become critical. By sunrise over the Pacific, the tension on the Itasca was rising. The ship's crew scanned the sky and horizon, straining to spot the small silver aircraft. Another message came. "We must be on you but cannot see you." It was 7:42 a.m. Howland time. The plane was close, perhaps within 100 kilometres, but visibility was poor, with low clouds and glare from the ocean surface. The crew fired smoke signals to help Earhart find them. No response. At 8:43 a.m, the most famous words of the entire flight came through the static. "We are on the line 157-337. We will repeat this message. We are running north and south." That line referred to a navigational bearing, a line of position based on the rising sun. It meant that Earhart and Noonan believed they were somewhere along that axis, but couldn't tell whether they were north or south of Howland. No further messages followed. The radio logs show increasing static, faint carrier waves, and then silence. The Electra never arrived. The fuel endurance time passed, and the ocean remained empty. What followed was one of the largest search efforts in aviation history. The US Navy and Coast Guard launched an immediate mission, covering more than 250,000 square miles of ocean. Ships, planes, and island patrols scanned the surface day after day. Nothing was found. No oil slick, no debris, no signal. The geography of the area made the search nearly impossible. Howland Island is barely 2 kilometers long and less than 1 kilometer wide, a dot in a vast blue void. The sea around it is deep, dropping to thousands of meters within a few miles of the shore. Even if Earhart had ditched safely, the chances of surviving long without being seen were slim. In the decades that followed, dozens of theories emerged. Some believed she ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean near Howland. Others suggested she and Noonan might have flown off course toward another island, perhaps Gardner Island, today called Nikumaroro, roughly 560 kilometers to the southeast. In 1940, British officers exploring Nikumaroro found partial human remains, a sextant box, and fragments of what looked like a woman's shoe. The bones were later lost, and the tests of the time were inconclusive. Later analyses using radio logs and drift patterns kept the debate alive. Modern research by groups like TIGAR examined the island's coral reefs and found aircraft aluminum fragments that some experts believe match the Electra's construction. Skeptics argue the evidence is circumstantial, as similar materials were used in other aircraft from the same era. Another theory points to the Marshall Islands, suggesting Earhart may have been forced to land there and later captured by Japanese forces. This story grew popular after World War II, fueled by rumours and a few unclear photographs, but official records offer no solid proof. The most technically accepted explanation remains the simplest: a navigational error combined with radio miscommunication. Fred Noonan relied on celestial navigation, taking sun sights with a sextant to calculate their position. But over open ocean, with cloud cover and limited visibility, even small errors could become fatal. The loss of two-way communication meant they could not receive bearing signals from the Itasca to correct their path. When Earhart reported running north and south along the line 157, 337, she was likely trying to locate Howland visually, burning precious fuel in the process. The US Navy's reconstruction later estimated the plane would have exhausted its fuel supply around 8:55 AM local time, about 12 minutes after her last transmission. If that was accurate, the aircraft may have ditched into the sea shortly after, disappearing within minutes into water nearly 5,000 meters deep. For oceanographers, this created one of the most complex search grids in aviation history. Drift models were plotted based on prevailing currents, wind speed, and estimated crash positions. The Navy's primary search area alone stretched across 150,000 square kilometers. Each ship traced a pattern through the water, a geometric sweep made tiny against the size of the Pacific. The vastness of that grid explains why, even with modern technology, the mystery remains. In 2002, deep-sea missions using sonar scanned parts of the ocean floor near Howland, but found no trace. Later expeditions revisited Nikumaroro, collecting metallic fragments, glass bottles, and a piece of plexiglass shaped like an Electra window. Still, no single discovery has confirmed the fate of Earhart and Noonan. The story of that morning remains frozen in a few lines of radio log and a handful of coordinates. The last known position of the aircraft, roughly 4°33 south, 159°7 east, is an estimate drawn from partial triangulation. From that point, the Pacific extends unbroken for thousands of kilometers in every direction. On board, the two aviators would have been facing the hardest decision of their careers. If they were north of Howland, turning south could save them. If they were south, that same move could send them deeper into empty sea. Clouds blurred the horizon, the sun climbed higher, the fuel gauges dropped. Each passing minute meant less margin for error. At 8:43 AM, the last message ended with steady, composed words. No panic, no distress signal, just the tone of two professionals still trying to navigate, unaware that the next silence would last forever. And over that silence, the endless line 157, 337 stretched across the Pacific, from nowhere to nowhere, still waiting for an aircraft that never came. BSAA Stardust, Avro-Lancastrian, 1947, Andes. The date was August 2nd, 1947. A British South American Airways flight, call sign Stardust, lifted off from Buenos Aires bound for Santiago, Chile. The aircraft was an Avro-Lancastrian, a converted bomber stripped of guns, redesigned for passengers and mail. On board were 6 crew members and 5 passengers. The route across the Andes was routine, flown many times before. The sky was clear over Argentina, and the flight plan estimated just over 4 hours. Captain Reginald Cook had flown in the Royal Air Force. His crew was experienced, their navigator meticulous, their radio operator trained to handle Morse code traffic. The Stardust climbed westward across the Pampas, leaving the flat plains behind as the mountains rose to meet them. There were no jetways, no radar, and no GPS. Every bearing, every altitude change depended on radio fixes and time. Through the afternoon, ground stations in Mendoza tracked the flight as it climbed into the Andes. The weather ahead was worsening. A cold front was rolling in from the Pacific, pushing a wall of cloud and snow over the peaks. Cook's crew knew they'd need to pass through turbulence and possible icing. Still, they were confident. The Lancastrian had power to spare. They maintained altitude around 24,000 feet, high enough to clear the range. At 5:41 p.m., as the aircraft neared the Chilean side, Santiago's air traffic control received a Morse transmission. It read simply, ETA Santiago 1745 Stendek. The word Stendek was repeated twice. Then the line went silent. The message was clear in signal but strange in meaning. The controller, unsure, asked for confirmation. The same word came again, Stendek. No one knew what it meant. Within minutes, the expected time of arrival passed. There was no contact, no sighting, no distress call. Santiago called again, repeatedly. The sky over the Andes began to darken. The Stardust had vanished. The next day, a large-scale search began. Planes from both Argentina and Chile flew back and forth along the route, tracing the flight path across the spine of South America. Snowstorms hampered visibility. Days passed, then weeks. Not a single piece of wreckage was seen. The assumption was that the aircraft must have gone down somewhere in the high mountains, an area where few people ever went. For years, Stendek became a kind of legend in itself. The cryptic word was the last trace of the flight. Some speculated it was a coded distress call. Others thought it might stand for Stenden Descend or Speedy Landing Expected. There were even theories that the message was sent in haste, the letters jumbled by turbulence or freezing hands. No one could agree, and the absence of wreckage left every idea possible. The Andes are not forgiving. The slopes around Mount Tupungato rise more than 20,000 feet. Glaciers move slowly there, grinding and burying whatever falls onto them. Over time, the Stardust became one of South America's great mysteries. Generations of climbers passed through the region without finding a trace. Then, in 1998, 51 years later, a group of Argentine climbers spotted something shining through the ice. It was metal, half buried in the glacier on the Chilean side of the border. A propeller. Nearby lay scraps of aluminum, rubber, and twisted steel. When the news reached investigators, they sent teams up the mountain. Over the following months, as the glacier receded, more pieces emerged, an engine block, fragments of the fuselage, and human remains preserved almost perfectly in ice. The mystery of where the Stardust had gone was finally solved. The aircraft had not disappeared over open terrain. It had struck the glacier near the summit of Mount Tupungato, instantly burying itself under snow and ice. The impact caused an avalanche that covered the wreckage completely, sealing it away for half a century. Forensic experts analysed what little remained. The bodies were still dressed in 1940s clothing, the fabrics intact. Small details, a flight cap, a shoe, a pocket watch, had survived as if time had stopped. The mailbags were recovered too, their letters frozen inside. The aircraft's position showed it had been just minutes from clearing the mountains. Investigators pieced together the likely sequence. The crew, relying on dead reckoning through cloud, may have believed they had already crossed the Andes and begun descending towards Santiago. In reality, strong headwinds had slowed them more than expected. Without radar or precise instruments, their estimate of distance was off. As they descended, still inside thick cloud, the mountains were directly ahead. The aircraft hit the glacier at more than 300 kilometers per hour. The radio message, Stendek, remains unexplained. Analysis of Morse code transmissions from that era shows that if the operator sent Stendek quickly, dots and dashes could blur into misread letters. Some think he meant to transmit standard ND of message decimal, a shorthand used by some operators, or that STENDC was a mistaken compression of standard ND of message. Others point out that Stendek was repeated exactly the same way twice, which suggests it was intentional, perhaps an internal BSAA code word that was never documented. No record of such a code has ever been found. For aviation historians, the rediscovery of Stardust was a rare case where myth turned back into fact. Every clue was locked in ice, shielded from time. The engines were examined, showing no sign of explosion or fire. The propellers indicated they were spinning at high power, meaning the crew had no idea they were about to crash. One of the altimeters recovered was frozen at roughly 14,000 feet, far too low to clear the nearby peaks. In the years after the discovery, forensic teams carefully removed remains and artifacts, cataloguing each item. Families of the passengers were notified after more than 5 decades of uncertainty. The mountain had kept the secret for generations, hiding the final minutes of a flight that vanished before anyone could even react. The impact site still lies within a narrow glacier basin, unreachable for most of the year. Each summer, as the ice melts, more fragments emerge, small pieces of metal, cloth, and glass from an aircraft frozen in time. Climbers occasionally come across new debris and report it to local authorities, but the main wreck has never been fully uncovered. The word Stendek continues to echo in aviation history, debated in books, documentaries, and code-breaking forums. Some call it a ghost in Morse, a final, misunderstood signal sent into stormy static, swallowed by snow before anyone could decode it. The recovered wreckage answered every question except that one. The flight's fate, the impact, the glacier, all explained by physics and weather, but that last word, clear and deliberate, remains the one part that no one can translate. In the control room in Santiago that evening in 1947, the operator who received the message repeated his call again and again, hoping for a correction. Each time only silence came back. Out there, above the clouds, the Stardust was already gone, resting on a mountain that would keep its secret for half a century beneath the frozen silence of the Andes. BSAA Star Tiger, Avritude of the Four, 1948, Bermuda sector. It was the night of January 29, 1948. A British South American Airways flight, the Star Tiger, was crossing the North Atlantic on its way to Bermuda. The aircraft, an Avritude of 4, carried 25 people, 6 crew and 19 passengers, including the airline's co-founder, Sir Arthur Conyngham, a respected air marshal from World War II. The flight had already faced weather delays, and the crew was eager to complete the final leg of its journey. At 3 p.m. local time, the Star Tiger departed from Santa Maria in the Azores. The destination was Bermuda, about 3,000 kilometers away. The aircraft had to fly through the same region where many earlier flights had reported turbulent, strong winds and unpredictable weather. Captain Brian W. McMillan, a veteran RAF pilot, decided to fly low, just over 2,000 feet above the ocean, to avoid strong headwinds at higher altitude. It was a bold choice, but one often used in those years to conserve fuel and maintain a smoother flight. The weather forecast was difficult. Patches of cloud, showers, and strong winds from the west. The estimated flight time was 12 hours. Radio operators in the Azores and Bermuda stayed tuned through the night, tracking the aircraft's progress. At 1:30 a.m., the crew of the Star Tiger contacted Bermuda's control center, confirming they were still on course. The messages were calm, routine, and professional. The navigator, David Colby, reported their position and expected arrival time for the following morning. Everything suggested a normal flight. At 3:17 a.m., radio operator Robert Tuck in Bermuda received another transmission. It came from Captain McMillan himself. He reported his estimated position and said everything was fine on board. The signal was clear and strong. Tuck acknowledged the message and logged the time. That was the last time anyone ever heard from the Star Tiger. When 4 a.m. passed with no further contact, Bermuda tried to re-establish communication. Calls were sent on all frequencies, but there was no response. The aircraft had been expected to appear on radar within an hour, It never did. By sunrise, concern had turned to alarm. The Star Tiger had vanished somewhere over the western Atlantic, less than 2 hours from landing. The US Air Force and Royal Air Force began an immediate search. Dozens of planes scoured the ocean between Bermuda and the last reported position. Ships were redirected from nearby routes to help. The search lasted 5 days. Not a single trace was found, no oil slick, no wreckage, no bodies. It was as if the aircraft had disappeared into thin air. The Star Tiger's disappearance came just months after the Stardust crash in the Andes. British South American Airways was under growing scrutiny. Questions were raised in Parliament and by aviation authorities. Families of the passengers demanded answers. The British government launched a full inquiry, hoping to find an explanation for the loss. The inquiry board reviewed the radio logs, weather data, and aircraft maintenance records. The Avro Tudor 4 was relatively new but had already faced criticism for reliability issues. The Star Tiger's engines had shown signs of wear and its heating system had been unreliable, a known problem on long Atlantic flights. Still, no technical issue in the logs pointed to a failure. One of the key focuses was the decision to fly so low. At 2,000 feet, the aircraft would be exposed to turbulence and crosswinds, and in poor visibility it would have little room to recover from any sudden drop. Investigators considered whether instrument failure or pilot disorientation could have caused the aircraft to lose altitude unnoticed. But Captain Macmillan's last transmission had sounded confident and normal, suggesting no immediate danger. The inquiry also reviewed fuel management. The flight had left the Azores fully fueled with enough reserves for Bermuda and emergency diversions. The low-altitude flight path, however, increased fuel burn. If headwinds were stronger than expected, the Star Tiger might have exhausted its reserves before reaching Bermuda. Yet no distress call or mayday was ever sent. Weather analysis added more complexity. That night, cold air masses from the north met warmer tropical air, creating heavy turbulence. Pilots in the same region reported sudden downdrafts strong enough to drop an aircraft hundreds of feet in seconds. If the Star Tiger had been caught in one of those without time to climb, it could have struck the water almost instantly. Flying low at night over dark ocean, there would have been no visible horizon, just cloud and reflection. A single moment of disorientation could be fatal. The inquiry board wrote that such a scenario was possible but impossible to prove. The lack of wreckage meant there was no way to confirm if the aircraft broke up mid-air or hit the sea in one piece. The investigation ended without a definite cause. The official statement read, "The fate of the aircraft remains unknown. It disappeared without trace." In the years that followed, the Star Tiger became linked with what the media soon began calling the Bermuda Triangle. The idea of a mysterious zone swallowing aircraft and ships was born out of disappearances like this one, a modern myth shaped by unanswered questions. But the original records tell a simpler story, a flight crossing one of the most unpredictable regions on Earth, at low altitude in bad weather with no radar guidance. Still, what continues to haunt researchers is how total the disappearance was. The ocean was calm enough that floating debris should have remained visible for days. Even lightweight materials, seat cushions, mailbags, personal effects, should have surfaced. The fact that nothing did suggests a high-speed impact or a breakup that scattered parts over a vast area. Inside the inquiry room, the tone of the final report was cautious. The investigators avoided speculation but acknowledged that a sudden loss of altitude, combined with instrument error and turbulence, was the most probable explanation. It was all they could write without evidence. For British South American Airways, the loss was devastating. The company's reputation suffered, and only a year later, another Tudor 4, the Star Ariel, would vanish in almost the same region under strikingly similar circumstances. Today, the final words from that night still stand alone in the record. A calm report at 3:17 a.m, a bearing acknowledged, and silence. Somewhere beyond that transmission, over the dark ocean, the aircraft and its passengers slipped from radio contact and from history, leaving investigators with only static paper logs and a map filled with empty coordinates. Northwest Orient Flight 2501 DC-4 1950, Lake Michigan. It was a summer night over the Midwest, June 23, 1950. Northwest Orient Airlines. Flight 2501 was flying from New York City to Seattle with a scheduled stop in Minneapolis. The aircraft, a Douglas DC-4 carried 55 passengers and 3 crew members. It was a popular route, and the skies were busy with post-war air traffic. But over Lake Michigan, as night closed in and a storm system began to build, the flight disappeared without a trace. At 11:13 p.m, Captain Robert Lind requested permission from air traffic control to descend from 3,500 feet to 2,500 feet. His reason was clear. The weather ahead looked violent. A line of thunderstorms was forming over the lake, stretching from Milwaukee down toward Chicago. Controllers in Chicago denied the request because other aircraft were in the same corridor. Lind acknowledged the message, held altitude, and pressed on. That was the last time anyone heard from Flight 2501. The plane was expected to reach Minneapolis just after midnight. When it failed to arrive, Northwest dispatchers tried to raise the crew on every frequency. No answer. By 1:30 a.m, civil and military radar stations were checking their scopes for any sign of the aircraft. There was nothing. At 5:30 a.m, the search began in earnest. The timing of the disappearance meant 2 clocks were running at once, one for the flight itself and one for the search. In the air, the DC-4's fuel endurance was roughly 8 hours. Even if it had turned off course or been forced down, its fuel would have been exhausted by dawn. For rescue teams, that meant every hour before sunrise mattered. By first light, the Coast Guard and Navy had vessels sweeping the surface of Lake Michigan. Pilots flying overhead described whitecaps whipped by strong winds. In the early morning haze, a few miles west of South Haven, Michigan, a Coast Guard cutter spotted an oil slick and small debris. Seat cushions, blankets, papers, fragments of insulation. Nearby, fishermen reported seeing a red flash during the night and hearing a loud noise like thunder. These were the first and only signs of Flight 2501. The recovery of bodies began almost immediately. Within days, the remains of several passengers washed ashore along the eastern coast of the lake, near South Haven and Glen. None were intact. The condition of the bodies suggested a high-speed impact with the water. Investigators concluded the aircraft had broken apart on contact, scattering debris across the lake bed. But despite weeks of searching with sonar, grappling hooks and divers, no large section of the fuselage was ever found. The weather that night had been extreme. The storm line stretched for hundreds of kilometers, with heavy lightning and winds exceeding 50 miles per hour. Captain Lind was an experienced pilot who had flown the DC-4 for years, but the combination of turbulence, low visibility and fatigue could turn a normal flight into chaos. Without radar or modern weather radar systems, pilots often flew blind through the dark, relying on brief radio updates. Air traffic control reconstructed the timeline from radio logs and flight plans. The last known position placed the aircraft over Lake Michigan at 3,500 feet heading northwest. After that, nothing. The descent request at 11:13 p.m. was the final transmission. If the plane continued for even a few more minutes, it would have been deep into the storm's core. As the second clock, the search clock, ticked on, the investigation spread to land. Teams combed Michigan's western shore for wreckage. Boats dragged sonar gear along mapped grids. Divers from the Navy scoured the most promising spots where debris had surfaced. In the 1950s, underwater search technology was primitive. Visibility in Lake Michigan was poor, the bottom covered in thick sediment that swallowed metal quickly. By early July, search leaders estimated they had covered an area of more than 4,000 square miles. Not one identifiable part of the DC-4's structure was recovered. The Civil Aeronautics Board, responsible for investigating accidents, ruled that the aircraft had likely entered a severe downdraft and lost control. The engines appeared to have been operating normally up to impact, based on fuel residue in recovered debris. The final report listed the cause as unknown. Flight 2501's disappearance was, at the time, the deadliest commercial aviation accident in US history. The 58 lives lost shocked the country, but without a wreckage field or flight recorders, which didn't exist yet, investigators had little to study. The only evidence came from fragments found on the surface and on shore, pieces too small to reconstruct what had happened. Local residents around South Haven still remember the night. Many described the storm as one of the worst they had ever seen. Lightning flickered non-stop for hours. Some claimed they heard a low engine roar above the wind just before a loud crash out on the lake. Fishermen who went out after the storm found debris floating in their nets. They handed it over to authorities, who marked coordinates and sent samples to laboratories. Nothing conclusive emerged. The grid search continued for months, long after hope of finding survivors had faded. Navy sonar equipment of the time could detect large metal objects, but the lake bottom's irregular terrain, ridges, valleys, and deep mud masked returns. Engineers suggested the wreck might have sunk into soft sediment, buried almost instantly. In places, the silt layer was over 40 feet deep. Forensic analysis of the recovered remains showed that all passengers had likely been seated at the moment of impact. No signs of in-flight fire or explosion were found. That eliminated theories of sabotage or mid-air breakup. The consensus became that the plane had simply lost control in violent weather, striking the lake at high speed. Decades later, new efforts to locate the wreck began. In the early 2000s, historian and author Clive Cussler's team from the National Underwater and Marine Agency conducted sonar sweeps across multiple sectors of the lake. They found several unidentified anomalies, but each turned out to be old shipwrecks, cargo vessels and barges from earlier centuries. The DC-4 remains hidden. Every attempt since has faced the same problem. Lake Michigan is vast and deep, and the crash site is uncertain within a radius of more than 50 kilometers. Shifting sand and silt continuously cover and uncover wrecks, moving them further into the mud. Without a clear signal, the aircraft's resting place remains invisible beneath the surface. For the families, the unanswered questions stretched for decades. A memorial now stands near South Haven, listing the names of everyone on board. The spot overlooks the water where the search began, where the first fragments of wreckage were found. Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 B777, 2014, Indian Ocean. At 12:41 a.m. on March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 lifted off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport. The Boeing 777 carried 239 people, passengers and crew bound for Beijing on a route flown daily without issue. The sky was clear, the aircraft was cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet. 90 minutes later, it disappeared from radar. The first hours seemed ordinary. The cockpit exchanged routine messages with Malaysian air traffic control as the jet approached the border between Malaysia and Vietnam. At 1:19 a.m., the last words were heard over the radio. "Good night, Malaysian 370. They were spoken calmly by the co-pilot. 2 minutes later, the aircraft's transponder stopped transmitting. On screens in Kuala Lumpur, the green dot representing MH370 faded. At first, controllers assumed a technical issue. It was not unusual for signals to drop briefly over handover zones. But when Vietnam failed to pick up the aircraft, confusion spread. Calls to the cockpit went unanswered. The aircraft had vanished somewhere over the South China Sea. The flight plan would have taken MH370 northeast, over the Gulf of Thailand and across southern China into Beijing. But unknown to anyone at that moment, the jet did not continue on its assigned path. Military radar data later revealed that within minutes of losing contact, the aircraft had turned sharply west, flying back across the Malaysian peninsula. Its transponder and automatic reporting systems remained off, but its radar signature continued briefly as it crossed over the Strait of Malacca, then disappeared again around 2:22 a.m. What happened during that turn remains one of aviation's greatest mysteries. No distress call was made, no hijack code transmitted, no mayday declared. For hours, search efforts focused on the wrong area, the South China Sea, while the aircraft was already far away, flying in a completely different direction. It took days for investigators to piece together a new clue. The Boeing 777 satellite communication system had remained intermittently connected to a satellite network operated by Inmarsat. Every hour, the system sent brief handshakes or pings to confirm its link. By analysing these signals, engineers could estimate the aircraft's distance from the satellite at each point in time. The results showed that MH370 had continued flying for nearly 7 hours after disappearing from radar. The final handshake came at 8:19 a.m. local time, long after its scheduled arrival in Beijing. The pattern of those pings formed a vast arc stretching across the southern Indian Ocean, far from any known flight route. Search teams began focusing on this remote region, an area of deep water powerful currents and few landmarks. The scale was almost unimaginable. More than 120,000 square kilometres of ocean floor to examine. Meanwhile, families waited in Kuala Lumpur and Beijing, watching news unfold in fragments. Initial reports conflicted. Some officials suggested a crash near Vietnam, others speculated about hijacking or mechanical failure. Governments from 26 countries joined the search, deploying ships, aircraft and satellites. The first search zones covered the Gulf of Thailand and the Andaman Sea before shifting southwest toward the Indian Ocean. Weeks passed without a trace. Then, in July 2015, 16 months later, a fragment of wing known as a flaperon washed ashore on Reunion Island near Madagascar. Tests confirmed it came from MH370. It was the first physical evidence that the aircraft had ended in the Indian Ocean. Over the next 2 years, more pieces were found along coastlines in Mozambique, Tanzania, and South Africa, consistent with drift models created by oceanographers. The forensic study of those fragments offered clues but no closure. The flaperon showed signs of damage consistent with a high-energy impact with water. Marine organisms on its surface indicated it had floated for over a year. Some internal cabin parts, a seat frame, a control surface actuator, were also recovered, but none revealed what caused the disappearance. No fire residues, no explosion patterns, no bullet marks. Investigators from the Australian Transport Safety Bureau led the underwater search, mapping vast stretches of seabed between 2014 and 2017. They found underwater volcanoes, valleys and deep trenches, but no aircraft. Sonar images were reviewed line by line. Each time a promising object appeared, robotic submersibles descended, only to reveal rocks or geological formations. The flight's data recorders, the black boxes, were never located. Without them, the final minutes of MH370 remained silent. Analysts could only model what might have happened from fuel burn, autopilot behaviour, and the final satellite pings. The last two handshakes, one partial, one complete, suggested a rapid descent. The aircraft may have run out of fuel, entered an uncontrolled dive, and hit the ocean at high speed. For forensic teams, even this theory left questions. The lack of floating debris early in the search was unusual for a crash at sea. Some experts proposed that the plane may have entered the water at a steep angle, breaking apart but sinking quickly, leaving few lightweight objects to drift. Others believed it glided for some distance before impact. The difference between those two scenarios could mean hundreds of kilometres in search radius. Inside control rooms in Kuala Lumpur, Canberra and Beijing, the timeline was reconstructed again and again. The final confirmed radar point was at 2:22 a.m. near the Andaman Sea. From there, the satellite data showed a long, unbroken journey south. The aircraft flew until fuel exhaustion around 8:19 a.m. Somewhere along that invisible arc in one of the most remote places on Earth, it vanished into the water. For the families, the lack of answers became its own kind of wound. In 2017, after more than 1,000 days, the official search was suspended. By then, more than $120 million had been spent and 25,000 square miles of seabed had been scanned. The report concluded that the location of the main wreckage could be outside the current search area, and that without new data, further operations would not likely succeed. Oceanographers later continued independent drift analysis, tracing currents backward from each recovered piece. Their models placed the likely crash zone within a narrow band in the southern Indian Ocean, near 35 degrees south latitude. In 2018, a private company funded by victims' families conducted another search using advanced underwater drones. It covered new areas of the ocean floor but again found nothing. Years later, the evidence still fits into only fragments. A calm goodnight over the radio, a vanished transponder, 7 hours of silent flight, and fragments washed ashore thousands of miles away. The rest lies beneath 4,000 metres of water. The phrase "Goodnight Malaysian 370" has since become one of the most analysed radio transmissions in history. Every word, every tone, every second has been studied, yet it reveals nothing unusual. It was the kind of farewell pilots said hundreds of times a day, a routine phrase before entering another country's airspace. BSAA Star Ariel, Avro Tudor 4, 1949, Bermuda Sector, January 17, 1949. Morning light stretched across Bermuda's Kindley Field as the British South American Airways aircraft Star Ariel prepared for takeoff. The plane was an Avro Tudor IV, sister ship to the Star Tiger, which had vanished a year earlier in nearly the same region. This flight was scheduled for Kingston, Jamaica, with a short list of passengers, just 20 people on board, including crew. The weather was calm, skies almost perfectly clear. It should have been an easy 3-hour flight across the Atlantic's western corridor. At 8:41 a.m, Captain John McPhee requested clearance for departure. He was a seasoned pilot known for methodical discipline. The aircraft lifted off smoothly and began climbing to its cruising altitude of 18,000 feet. The first message came through 10 minutes later. Airborne at 0841, climbing through 18,000 feet, estimating Kingston at 1240. It was routine, precise, and without concern. By 9:13 a.m, the Star Ariel sent another transmission confirming its position over 230 miles south of Bermuda. The radio operator reported clear visibility and no turbulence. The aircraft was to switch frequencies to contact Kingston radio. The handover was acknowledged, and that was the last message ever received. There was no distress call, no sign of mechanical failure, no weather hazard, just silence. When Star Ariel failed to arrive at its scheduled time, air traffic controllers in Kingston began calling repeatedly on all channels. No reply. They contacted Bermuda to confirm the last communication, and the two control centres compared logs. The last transmission from the aircraft had ended normally, with no hint of trouble. Within hours, both sides agreed something had gone terribly wrong. By the afternoon, British South American Airways declared the aircraft overdue. A search began before sunset. Planes from both Bermuda and Jamaica took off to retrace the flight path. The US Navy joined in, deploying long-range patrol aircraft and ships across a grid pattern covering 100,000 square miles. The weather, ironically, was perfect for searching. Cloudless skies, calm seas, unlimited visibility. But they found nothing. No oil slick, no debris, no floating wreckage, not even a single seat cushion. The disappearance of the Star Ariel stunned investigators. It was almost identical to the loss of the Star Tiger a year before. Same airline, same aircraft model, same general route, and the same eerie silence before vanishing. The Avro Tudor IV was again under scrutiny. The official inquiry opened in London and Bermuda weeks later. Inside the hearing rooms, investigators from the Air Ministry and BSAA reconstructed the timeline. Every message from the flight was analysed, every weather report cross-checked. Meteorological data showed ideal flying conditions throughout the morning, clear air, no storm activity. Nothing in the records suggested environmental danger. The Star Ariel had carried an experienced crew. Captain McPhee had logged more than 11,000 flight hours. His radio operator Jack Berry had maintained consistent communication during all previous flights. The maintenance logs from Bermuda showed the aircraft had passed inspection before departure. Fuel tanks were filled, and no mechanical issues had been reported. The inquiry considered the possibility of mid-air structural failure, a sudden breakup that could have scattered debris over a wide area. But the Tudor IV's airframe, though criticised for earlier reliability issues, had no history of spontaneous structural collapse in flight. Investigators concluded that if such an event had occurred, some evidence, even small fragments, should have been visible on the surface. None was. Attention then turned to communications. Several aircraft flying in the region that day reported unusual radio interference. One US Navy pilot mentioned periods of total blackout on certain frequencies around the same time the Star Ariel vanished. Another aircraft from Pan American reported static and weak transmissions. Atmospheric conditions in the Bermuda sector were known to cause strange ionospheric disturbances, occasionally blocking or distorting radio signals over long distances. The inquiry noted this but could not link it directly to the disappearance. Some theorised that an onboard electrical failure could have simultaneously disabled both the radio and navigation systems. In that scenario, the Star Ariel might have flown far off course without realising it. However, the crew would likely have attempted to transmit on emergency frequencies. No such attempts were recorded. Investigators mapped possible routes based on fuel load and time since takeoff. The aircraft's last known position was about 230 miles south of Bermuda, near latitude 25 degrees north. From there, its flight path should have been a straight line to Kingston. If it had continued as planned, it would have crossed open ocean for roughly 2 more hours before reaching landfall. Search aircraft combed both sides of that route, extending hundreds of miles east and west. Not one signal or sighting came back. In the inquiry room, the Air Ministry panel listened to testimony from meteorologists, pilots and radio engineers. One expert suggested that an explosion caused by fuel vapours might have destroyed the aircraft mid-air. Another proposed cabin depressurization, leading to loss of consciousness. Both ideas were dismissed as speculative. The Tudor's pressurization system had been upgraded, and no evidence pointed to an onboard fire. The final report, issued later that year, offered little more than theories. It stated that the cause of the accident cannot be determined, and that the aircraft was presumed to have suffered sudden failure leading to loss of control. In other words, the Star Ariel had simply disappeared without trace. The loss hit British South American Airways hard. The company had already been under pressure after the Star Tiger tragedy. 2 aircraft of the same model vanishing in the same region within 12 months damaged public trust beyond repair. By the end of 1949, BSAA was absorbed into BOAC, British Overseas Airways Corporation, effectively ending its independent operations. The Bermuda region soon gained a new reputation. Journalists began linking the 2 disappearances to other maritime and aviation losses in the area, coining the phrase the Bermuda Triangle. Though the inquiry rejected any supernatural explanation, the pairing of the Star Tiger and Star Ariel became the foundation for decades of speculation. Back in Bermuda, controllers who'd spoken to the Star Ariel that morning kept the flight log open for hours after the last transmission, waiting for a call that never came. Every few minutes they tried the Kingston frequency again. Static filled the room. At 1:10 p.m. the board was cleared and the flight was marked overdue. The sequence of final messages remained strikingly ordinary. Each line of the log reads like any other day in aviation: time, altitude, estimated arrival. There was no deviation, no warning, just a normal flight that faded into the quiet sky between 2 islands, leaving behind nothing but radio silence and paperwork. Flying Tiger Line Flight 739, L1049, 1962, Western Pacific. March 16, 1962. A Lockheed L1049 Super Constellation lifted off from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam at 12:57 a.m. The aircraft belonged to the Flying Tiger Line, a US charter carrier known for transporting military personnel and cargo during the Cold War. On this flight, 93 people were on board. 96, including the crew if counting an additional manifest error later corrected. Most of them US Army soldiers being transported to Saigon, South Vietnam. The plane's route was straightforward: Guam to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, a flight of about 6 hours across the Western Pacific. At first, everything went as planned. The radio logs from Guam recorded standard position checks as the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude. The weather along the route was mostly clear, with scattered clouds and a few distant squalls. Captain Gregory Thomas, a former Air Force pilot with over 20 years of flying experience, gave calm, precise updates. At 1:28 a.m, the crew reported level flight at 18,000 feet. Then, at 2:22 a.m, came the last transmission. Position 137 degrees east, 13 degrees north, all normal. After that, silence. 2 clocks started ticking, one in the cockpit that no longer moved, and one on the ground that measured every minute the aircraft failed to report. When the scheduled next call didn't arrive at 3:30 a.m, controllers at Guam began attempts to contact the flight. There was no response. Calls from other aircraft in the area also went unanswered. By dawn, the Air Force declared the plane overdue. The search began within hours. The US military mobilized one of the largest peacetime search efforts in Pacific history. Over 1,300 people participated. Navy ships, Air Force reconnaissance planes, and Coast Guard cutters scouring an area of 200,000 square miles of ocean between Guam and the Philippines. For 8 straight days, the search grid expanded outward from the last reported position. Crews flew overlapping patterns, recording every sighting of floating debris or oil. None of it matched the missing aircraft. Witness reports surfaced almost immediately. A Liberian oil tanker, the SS TL Lenzen, claimed its crew had seen a bright flash in the night sky at approximately the time and area where Flight 739 should have been. The crew described it as a white light followed by 2 red explosions before it faded. They believed that it had been an aircraft. The position they reported, about 500 miles west of Guam, aligned closely with the flight's expected path. The Coast Guard logged the coordinates and redirected ships to that zone, but when they arrived, there was nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no sign of life. Investigators faced an almost total lack of evidence. The super constellation was a large, 4-engine aircraft, more than 100 feet long. A crash at sea should have produced floating debris, seat cushions, life vests, rafts, even paper. The fact that nothing was found puzzled everyone involved. If the aircraft had exploded at high altitude, fragments should have drifted across hundreds of miles. If it had ditched intact, survivors might have been spotted during the first days of daylight search, yet the sea was empty. Inside the inquiry room weeks later, military and civilian investigators examined the logs. The last radio position placed the aircraft about halfway to the Philippines, cruising normally. There had been no weather warnings or mechanical complaints. The Constellation's engines had been serviced days before departure and were operating well. The captain had flown the same route several times. Every known factor pointed to a routine flight. The inquiry board reviewed several possible causes. One was mechanical failure, an in-flight fire, fuel leak or structural breakup, but those events almost always leave evidence on the surface. The total absence of debris made investigators hesitant to endorse it. Another theory was sabotage. Because most passengers were US Army personnel heading to Vietnam, rumours quickly spread that the aircraft could have been targeted, but the flight had originated from a secure military base, and security records showed no unauthorised access or cargo. The possibility of a mid-air explosion from within could not be ruled out, but no proof existed. The testimony of the SS Lenzen crew was debated intensely. Could they have mistaken a meteor for an aircraft explosion? Mariners in the Pacific often reported fireballs or flares that looked like distant detonations. But the crew's detailed timing and description, including the vertical breakup and separate flashes, made the account difficult to dismiss. If it truly was Flight 739, the explosion would have occurred about 90 minutes after its last routine position report. As the days passed, the search clock outlasted the flight clock. By the second week, hopes of finding survivors faded. The US Navy's Task Force 130 completed nearly 500 flight hours and 144 surface vessel sweeps. Not a single verified fragment was recovered. The official report concluded that the aircraft had been presumed lost over water for unknown reasons. Families of the passengers and crew demanded answers. Some of the soldiers had written home days earlier, describing excitement about their upcoming deployment. Others had sent telegrams from Guam. The Army confirmed that none of the men ever arrived in the Philippines. Their names were later added to memorials for service members lost in non-combat operations. In the inquiry hearings, aviation engineers noted that the Lockheed L-1049 had a reputation for reliability, but required constant maintenance. Its long-range and complex fuel system meant that a small fault could escalate quickly. Yet, again, there was no sign that such a fault had occurred on this flight. Weather charts from that night showed stable conditions, light winds and clear skies. The aircraft had been flying above the layer of scattered clouds in smooth air. By the 10th day, search operations were scaled back. Radio silence persisted across every frequency. The final coordinates plotted on the board in the inquiry room formed a point surrounded by hundreds of nautical miles of deep ocean, depths exceeding 17,000 feet. Recovery, even if the location had been known, would have been impossible with the technology of the time. The investigators' final summary read, "The cause of disappearance cannot be determined." In the margin of one transcript, an officer wrote by hand, "No evidence of fire, explosion, or ditching. Total loss unexplained." Years later, retired Navy personnel would still recall the Lenzen sighting. Some believed the aircraft may have exploded due to fuel vapor ignition in one of the main tanks. Others suggested sabotage from within, though nothing was ever proven. Constellations had suffered fuel-related explosions before, usually near tanks located in the center wing section. But those accidents left debris. Flight 739 left nothing. The time gap between the last normal contact and the first sighting of the flash defined the mystery. 2 hours of unknown flight, 2 hours where something changed, silently in the sky. The flight clock had stopped at an unknown moment. The search clock ran for weeks, measuring effort, distance, and frustration. every day that passed without a single discovery widened the mystery. Pakistan International Airlines, Flight 404 F-27, 1989, Himalaya. On August 25, 1989, a Pakistan International Airlines Fokker F-27 Friendship, registered APBBF, taxied across the small tarmac of Gilgit Airport in northern Pakistan. The twin-engine turboprop was scheduled to fly south to Islamabad, a short domestic route that wound through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth, the lower Himalayas and the Karakoram Range. The flight was numbered 404. It carried 49 people on board, including 5 crew. Gilgit sits in a narrow valley carved by the Gilgit River, surrounded by steep mountains that rise thousands of meters almost straight from the runway. Flights there depend on precise timing and weather. In clear skies, the trip takes less than an hour. In poor conditions, cloud banks and downdrafts make the corridor a maze of invisible walls. At 7:36 a.m., the aircraft began its takeoff roll. The weather that morning was marginal. Low clouds clung to the ridges, and visibility was patchy. Local reports noted that the peaks were partially obscured, but the valley itself remained open. Captain Tariq Habib, one of PIA's senior pilots with experience in mountain routes, made the decision to depart. The tower cleared Flight 404 for takeoff. Minutes later, as the aircraft climbed over the river valley, radio contact was established with the control tower. Everything sounded routine. The crew reported reaching altitude and turning south toward Islamabad. The tower acknowledged and logged the time. Then, as the aircraft moved deeper into the mountains, the signal faded. That was the last transmission ever heard from Flight 404. By 8:30 a.m., Islamabad Control had not received the expected handover call. Controllers assumed a minor radio delay, common in mountain regions where ridges blocked signals. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the silence grew more serious. The flight never arrived. By midday, PIA declared the aircraft missing. The Pakistani Army, Air Force and civil authorities launched an immediate search. Helicopters were dispatched from Gilgit and Skardu, while ground teams began climbing towards known mountain passes along the flight path. The search grid was enormous. The route between Gilgit and Islamabad passes over some of the highest terrain in Asia. Valleys at 4,000 feet surrounded by peaks rising above 20,000. Many areas are unreachable except by foot. In late August, monsoon clouds often sweep through without warning, reducing visibility to zero within minutes. For pilots, even a small navigational drift could mean crossing into a blind canyon with no exit. Search teams focus first on the Kakan Valley and Babusar Pass area, roughly along the aircraft's intended track. Villagers were questioned. Some reported hearing a loud sound that morning, like distant thunder, followed by silence. Others said they saw low-flying planes but couldn't confirm details. Nothing definite emerged. Helicopters flew daily sorties, mapping grids along possible valleys and ridges. The work was slow and dangerous. Thin air at high altitude limited hover time, and sudden downdrafts made even search flights risky. Days passed with no sign of wreckage, smoke or impact marks. The Fokker F-27 was relatively small, about 25 meters long, and painted in white and green, colors that could easily blend with snow and rock. As the search expanded, the geography of the region turned from obstacle to adversary. To the east lay Nanga Parbat, the 9th highest mountain in the world. To the west, the Hindu Kush extended for hundreds of kilometers of jagged peaks. Between them stretched valleys so deep that sunlight reached their floors for only a few hours each day. After a week, officials began to suspect that the aircraft might have crashed in one of these hidden valleys, possibly covered by snow or buried under a landslide triggered by the impact. Monsoon rains during the following days made conditions worse. Floods cut off roads and trails. The search was suspended temporarily, then resumed once the weather cleared. The inquiry room in Islamabad became the center of operations. Maps covered the walls, marked with colored pins showing flight paths, witness reports and search zones. Engineers reviewed maintenance records of the aircraft. The Fokker F-27 had a good service history. There were no open technical issues, and it had completed its previous flight without incident. The pilot, Captain Habib, was considered one of PIA's most competent mountain route commanders. Investigators also studied the weather logs. Satellite data from that morning showed cloud cover spreading unevenly through the northern valleys, with clear spots around Gilgit but heavy formations near Abbottabad and the Kagan Valley. Pilots familiar with the route told investigators that sudden fog or downdrafts were common. If the aircraft had descended slightly below its assigned altitude to stay under cloud, it might have clipped a ridge before regaining visibility. In such terrain, even a brief mistake could be fatal. Another theory suggested that the aircraft could have deviated west toward the Indus River, seeking an alternate route through clearer air. But radar coverage in 1989 was limited to areas near major cities. Over the mountains, the F-27 would have been invisible to controllers. Without a radar trace or emergency beacon signal, there was no way to pinpoint its final position. The Civil Aviation Authority calculated the maximum range based on the aircraft's fuel load. If it had flown south without deviation, it should have run out of fuel around 8:30 am. If it had been forced to circle or turn back due to weather, it could have gone down anywhere within a 100-kilometre radius of Gilgit. The search grid expanded again, this time including high-altitude glaciers near Chilas and the northern slopes of Naran. Still, nothing was found. For the families of those on board, the uncertainty was unbearable. Many had relatives waiting at Islamabad airport when the disappearance was announced. PIA set up a crisis desk, posting daily updates. As days turned to weeks, officials had to admit they had no wreckage, no bodies, no black box. Nothing to explain where the aircraft had gone. In the following months, local shepherds and mountaineers occasionally reported spotting metallic glints on distant slopes. Each time, the army sent reconnaissance teams to check. None of the leads produced results. Some turned out to be fragments of old weather balloons, others natural reflections from rock or ice. When winter arrived, the passes closed under heavy snow. Search operations were suspended until the next spring. By then, most officials believed the aircraft had gone down in an inaccessible area of the mountains, possibly buried beneath snow or ice that would never melt. Inside the inquiry room, investigators compiled their final notes. The report acknowledged the limitations of the search: extreme terrain, unpredictable weather, lack of radar coverage, and the short range of the aircraft's emergency locator. Without physical evidence, the cause of the disappearance could not be established. The official record closed with the words, "Aircraft presumed destroyed. Location unknown. Varig Flight 967 B707 cargo, 1979, Pacific." On the night of January 30th, 1979, Varig Flight 967 prepared for departure from Narita International Airport in Tokyo. The aircraft, a Boeing 700-7300-23C cargo jet, was loaded with 153 paintings by the Japanese-Brazilian artist Manabu Mabe, along with electronics and mail bound for Rio de Janeiro. In the cockpit were 6 crew members, all experienced aviators led by Captain Gilberto Araujo da Silva, a pilot who had survived the Varig Flight 820 crash in Paris 6 years earlier. It was a routine long-haul cargo run, scheduled to make refueling stops in Los Angeles and Lima before crossing to Brazil. At 8:23 p.m. Tokyo time, the aircraft took off from runway 34L. The weather was calm, the night clear, and the takeoff uneventful. As it climbed through 11,000 feet, Captain da Silva contacted Tokyo Control to report the aircraft's position. Climbing to flight level 270, he said. The controller acknowledged. It was the last radio contact ever received. Minutes later, radar screens at Tokyo Approach lost the blip representing Flight 967. Controllers attempted to re-establish contact on multiple frequencies. There was no reply. The aircraft had disappeared from radar roughly 200 kilometers southeast of Japan over the Pacific Ocean. No distress signal, no emergency transmission, nothing to indicate trouble. Within an hour, Japan's civil aviation authorities declared an emergency. At 10 p.m., the Japanese Coast Guard and US military began coordinating search operations. The first aircraft were dispatched overnight from Yokota Air Base and Yokosuka. By dawn, ships and helicopters were sweeping the ocean along the jet's last known flight path. The Pacific in that area is deep, more than 9,000 feet in some parts, and strong currents make surface searches difficult. The initial search area spanned 1,400 square kilometers. Oil slicks were spotted the next day near the Izu Islands, but tests revealed no jet fuel residue. Floating debris was also recovered, wooden crates, fragments of cargo netting, but none confirmed as coming from the Varig aircraft. The Boeing 707 carried no passengers, only cargo and crew, so there were no emergency beacons triggered from life rafts or handheld transmitters. Investigators reconstructed the early timeline. Flight 967 had taken off with full fuel for the first leg to Los Angeles. The engines had passed all checks, and maintenance logs showed no technical irregularities. The crew's communications up to the last contact were calm and routine. The disappearance occurred just 20 minutes after takeoff, while climbing through controlled airspace still within range of multiple radio stations. Forensic analysis of possibilities began almost immediately. The first and simplest theory was catastrophic mechanical failure, a sudden explosion, fire, or decompression that destroyed the aircraft before a distress call could be sent. But the Boeing 707's design made instantaneous breakups rare. If a fire had started in the cargo hold, at least one of the pilots should have had time to broadcast an emergency message. No such call was recorded. Weather data from that night ruled out lightning or severe turbulence. The Pacific near Japan was clear with light winds. The possibility of mid-air collision was considered, but there were no other aircraft in the vicinity on the same altitude or route. Japanese radar systems and civilian air traffic control both confirmed no secondary blips nearby. Attention then shifted to the cargo itself. Among the shipments on board were electronic components and the 153 paintings packed in wooden crates. Investigators asked whether any cargo might have been hazardous or unstable. Varig's cargo manifest showed no flammable or dangerous materials declared. However, speculation arose later that certain industrial goods being transported may have included lithium-based batteries or chemicals not properly listed. None of this could be confirmed without wreckage. The search continued for nearly a week, expanding outward each day. More than 20 aircraft and 25 ships from Japan, the United States and Brazil participated. The US Navy used sonar to scan portions of the ocean floor where radar contact had last been logged. No wreckage appeared. Currents in the region were known to disperse debris quickly toward the Philippine Sea, but not a single confirmed item from Flight 967 was ever found. Back in Rio, the disappearance dominated headlines. The loss of the Manabu Mabi paintings, a collection valued in the millions, added an unusual cultural dimension to the tragedy. The works had been exhibited in Japan and were being returned to Brazil. Not one was ever recovered. In the investigation offices, flight engineers reviewed the possibility of a pressurization failure causing crew incapacitation. The Boeing 707 had oxygen systems designed for emergencies, but a sudden depressurization at climb altitude could render the crew unconscious within seconds. In such cases, autopilot might continue flight until fuel exhaustion, sending the aircraft into the ocean hours later. But that theory conflicted with radar data, which showed contact ending abruptly, not gradually as it would if the aircraft had flown onward. Japanese radar operators were interviewed. Their logs indicated the Boeing's transponder signal disappeared at 8:37 p.m, just 14 minutes after takeoff, with no sign of deviation or descent. The radar trace simply faded, suggesting a rapid loss of altitude or electronic failure. The area where the signal ended lies over deep water, near the boundary between Japan's continental shelf and the open Pacific Trench. In Tokyo, representatives from Varig and Boeing joined Japanese and Brazilian officials for closed-door inquiry sessions. Inside those rooms, each possible chain of events was dissected. Could the aircraft have exploded mid-air due to a fuel leak during climb? The 707's fuel lines had been inspected, and the tanks were pressurized within normal limits. Could a cockpit fire have knocked out communications? Investigators noted that cockpit voice recorders in 1979 were primitive compared to modern ones, and Flight 967's data recorders would have stopped transmitting the instant power was lost. As days turned into weeks, the search grid became a map of empty coordinates. Japanese maritime patrols continued intermittent sweeps for several months. Nothing new was found. Without wreckage, the official inquiry reached a dead end. The report, filed jointly by Japanese and Brazilian authorities, listed the cause as unknown. Forensics without a wreck meant that every scenario had to remain open. Pilot error was dismissed. The crew's record was exemplary. Sabotage was mentioned only briefly. There were no threats or motives recorded. One investigator speculated privately that a sudden depressurization or structural failure near the cargo area could have disabled systems instantly. Others believed the aircraft may have broken apart on impact after losing control, sinking before any floating debris could surface. Captain Gilberto da Silva's history added a grim layer. In 1973, he had commanded Varig Flight 820, which crash-landed near Orly Airport in Paris after an onboard fire filled the cabin with smoke. He survived that accident and continued flying, known for his professionalism. 6 years later, he disappeared without trace over the Pacific. Oceanographic data later confirmed that the area where Flight 967 was last seen sits above a trench more than 9,000 meters deep, an abyss where even modern deep-sea technology struggles to reach. Experts estimate that if the aircraft hit the water intact, it would have sunk in minutes, leaving only minor surface debris that currents could scatter within hours. National Airlines Flight 967 DC-7 1959, Gulf of Mexico. It was the night of November 16, 1959. National Airlines Flight 967, a Douglas DC-7B, prepared for its overnight trip from Tampa, Florida to New Orleans. The aircraft was part of the airline's regular Sunshine State route, a reliable service across the Gulf of Mexico. On board were 42 people, 35 passengers and 7 crew. The captain was Frank K. Seitz, a veteran with more than 10,000 flight hours. The weather was calm, visibility clear, and the Gulf was quiet. The aircraft lifted off from Tampa International Airport at 12:44 a.m. local time. It climbed smoothly to its assigned altitude of 18,000 feet and set course westward across the open water. The early transmissions were normal. The co-pilot reported their estimated time of arrival in New Orleans, 2:45 a.m. The flight continued through clear skies. At 1:07 a.m., a brief radio message came through to the New Orleans Control Center. It was a routine position report. Calm, precise, like hundreds of others every night. Then, nothing. Controllers expected another check-in within 30 minutes. It never came. At 2:45 a.m., when the aircraft failed to appear on radar and did not respond to repeated calls, the US Air Force and Coast Guard declared it missing. Within hours, a massive search began across the Gulf of Mexico. The first aircraft and ships were dispatched at dawn. The search area was based on the DC-7's last known position, about 90 miles west of Tampa, near the center of the Gulf corridor. The sea was smooth, the weather ideal for visual scanning. On the second day, small pieces of floating debris began to appear. A life jacket, a section of cabin insulation, seat cushions and papers, all confirmed to belong to Flight 967. By the third day, Coast Guard vessels recovered human remains, fragmented and burned, suggesting an explosion or high-impact crash. No large sections of the aircraft were ever found. The floating debris field was small, which puzzled investigators. In a typical ocean crash, wreckage spreads widely. The concentration of debris in one area, along with the condition of the bodies, suggested that something catastrophic had happened suddenly and violently. In the days that followed, reports surfaced of fishermen and merchant crews who claimed to have seen a flash in the night sky over the Gulf around the same time. Some described it as a distant orange glow, others as a white explosion. None could pinpoint the location, but all matched the approximate time the aircraft disappeared. When the first findings reached the inquiry room, investigators from the Civil Aeronautics Board and the FBI joined forces. The reason was simple. Some evidence pointed to a possible criminal act. One passenger stood out, a man named Robert Spears. He was listed on the manifest, but he never boarded the plane. Instead, a ticket agent remembered another man checking in under his name. That man, later identified as William Taylor, was a former convict and known associate of Spears. Investigators discovered that Taylor had been paid to fly under Spears' identity. The real Spears had taken out a large life insurance policy that would pay out if he died on the flight. The pieces of the puzzle deepen the mystery. If Spears had orchestrated an insurance fraud, then Taylor, the man actually on board, was the one who perished. But the way the flight ended suggested more than fraud. The pattern of debris and the burned remains led investigators to suspect a possible onboard explosion. Forensics teams analysed the recovered parts for residue of explosives. They examined fragments of cabin insulation and metal, testing for nitrates and chemical traces. The results were inconclusive. Saltwater exposure and fuel contamination made precise testing impossible. The Civil Aeronautics Board stopped short of declaring an explosion, but noted that the condition of the wreckage and remains suggested the possibility. Meanwhile, the FBI focused on Spears. He had vanished after the crash. When located weeks later, he denied involvement. Investigators discovered that he had a history of fraud, and the evidence indicated he had faked his death using the plane ticket and identity swap. Taylor, posing as him, boarded the aircraft unknowingly. But even if Spears had intended only to disappear, that didn't explain the loss of the entire plane. Inside the inquiry room, speculation turned to two main possibilities: a mid-air explosion or an in-flight fire. The DC-7's fuel system was complex, with tanks located in the wings and fuselage. A leak or spark could ignite fuel vapours, especially if a maintenance fault existed. Yet there had been no sign of trouble before the last radio message. The crew had reported nothing unusual: no smell of smoke, no drop in power, no turbulence. Everything pointed to an instantaneous event. Investigators mapped the time and distance based on flight performance. At 1:07 a.m, the aircraft was approximately halfway across the Gulf. If it had exploded at that point, debris should have spread across a wide radius. But the recovery teams found no floating sections larger than a few feet. The fuselage, engines and wings remained missing. The Gulf's depth at that location exceeds 4,000 feet, making recovery impossible with 1950s technology. Forensics without a wreck meant guesswork. The lack of impact craters or fuel slicks suggested an explosion high enough that debris burned before reaching the water. Still, no one could determine whether that explosion was mechanical or deliberate. Witness testimony was compiled into charts. One ship's crew reported a distant flash around 1:10 a.m. Others said they heard a low rumble. None could confirm direction or height. The inquiry panel studied atmospheric data. There were no thunderstorms or lightning at the time. Whatever caused the flash was not weather. Back in Washington, the Civil Aeronautics Board weighed whether to officially link the disappearance to sabotage. Without chemical proof or wreckage, they couldn't. The final report stated that the cause of the accident was undetermined. The FBI's parallel investigation into Robert Spears concluded separately. Insurance fraud confirmed, connection to the crash unproven. Spears was later convicted on unrelated charges, but never for the events of Flight 967. The loss of the aircraft left lingering questions. The DC-7B was one of the most advanced piston-engine airliners of its era, capable of long overwater routes. It had no prior structural issues, and its maintenance record from Tampa was clear. The pilots were trained for oceanic operations. Everything about the flight had been normal until the instant it vanished. In later years, retired investigators revisited the case. Some believed the aircraft's pressurization system might have failed, triggering an explosion in the forward cabin. Others thought a fuel tank rupture could have caused a blast strong enough to tear the fuselage apart. Without wreckage, every theory remained theoretical. The recovered human remains were buried in a common grave in New Orleans, their identities impossible to confirm. Among the lost was the flight's co-pilot, who had recently transferred from another route, and several passengers returning from Florida vacations. The tragedy received wide coverage at the time, but was soon overshadowed by other accidents. Pan Am Flight 7, Romance of the Skies, B377, 1957, Central Pacific, November 8, 1957. At 16:04 local time, Pan American World Airways Flight 7, known as Romance of the Skies, lifted off from San Francisco International Airport. The aircraft was a Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, a luxurious double-deck propeller airliner famous for its comfort and range. On board were 36 passengers and 8 crew members. The destination was Honolulu, the first leg of a round-the-world service that connected the United States to Asia. It was a clear Friday afternoon with no signs of trouble in the weather reports. The flight crew was led by Captain Gordon H. Brown, an experienced pilot with over 9,000 flight hours. His first officer, William Fortenberry, and flight engineer Ernest Hill were both veterans of Pan Am's Pacific routes. The aircraft carried full fuel for the 400-mile journey, and every system checked out before departure. At 4:04 p.m, Flight 7 left the California coast and headed west over the Pacific. Radio contact with Oakland air traffic control remained normal for the first few hours. The Stratocruiser cruised at 21,000 feet, reporting light winds and clear skies. The last position report came at 5:04 p.m. The aircraft was 1,300 miles from San Francisco, still climbing smoothly. The next scheduled check-in was due around 6:30 p.m. It never came. When the scheduled report didn't arrive, controllers at Oakland began calling repeatedly on every frequency. There was no response. Radar coverage in 1957 did not extend far beyond the coast, so there was no electronic trace to follow. As night fell over the Pacific, Pan Am declared an emergency. By morning, a large-scale search was underway. The US Navy, Coast Guard and Pan Am aircraft began scouring the ocean between San Francisco and Hawaii. The search area covered nearly 400,000 square miles of open water. For 2 days, there was no sign of the missing plane. Then, on the third day, a Navy patrol aircraft spotted a patch of debris floating in the central Pacific, about 1,100 miles northeast of Honolulu. When rescue ships reached the area, they found a grim scene. Floating among bits of wreckage and cargo were several bodies, passengers and crew still wearing life vests. The aircraft's main structure was gone, but small fragments of cabin walls, luggage and seat cushions were recovered. The waterlogged debris was scattered over several miles, forming no clear pattern. Forensic examination of the recovered bodies began as soon as they reached Honolulu. The condition of the remains suggested that some people had survived the initial impact long enough to put on life vests. That meant the aircraft had likely made a forced descent rather than disintegrating mid-air. But the injuries and burns found on some of the victims told a different story. High-speed impact with fire and fragmentation. The combination made little sense. Investigators gathered in the inquiry room in San Francisco. Engineers from Boeing, Pan Am, and the Civil Aeronautics Board studied every piece of evidence. The first question was whether mechanical failure had brought the aircraft down. The Boeing 377 had a reputation for reliability, but required careful fuel management across its 4 large radial engines. Earlier flights had suffered problems with engine vibration and overheating. If an engine had failed, asymmetric thrust might have caused loss of control. But the recovered wreckage told no clear story. Sections of fuselage and tail were missing. One propeller hub recovered from the sea showed signs of stress. Bent blades consistent with power at impact. That meant at least one engine had still been running when the aircraft hit the water. Another clue came from the fuel. Chemical traces indicated one of the engines may have been running lean, possibly overheated, or on fire before the crash. Pan Am's internal maintenance records were reviewed line by line. The aircraft, registered to 90,944, had recently undergone routine inspection in San Francisco. No faults had been logged. The flight engineer's notes from previous legs reported all systems functioning. The inquiry considered the possibility of cabin depressurization or fire. The Stratocruiser's pressurization system relied on bleed air from the engines. A failure there could have forced a rapid descent, but none of the recovered debris showed soot or melting consistent with a large onboard fire. The small burns on clothing and skin appeared to have come from post-impact fuel ignition, not from an in-flight blaze. Then came an unusual forensic detail. When toxicology tests were conducted on some of the recovered crew, traces of carbon monoxide were found in their blood. The concentrations were high enough to suggest exposure to smoke before the crash. Investigators were puzzled. There had been no evidence of fire in the wreckage, yet several bodies carried signs of inhalation. This meant that smoke, possibly from an engine failure or cabin leak, might have entered the aircraft before it hit the water. Another clue came from the distribution of the wreckage. Oceanographers noted that debris was unusually localized for a high-speed crash, indicating the aircraft might have descended under some control before impact. That theory fit with the life vests and lack of a distress call. The crew could have been fighting a developing emergency that worsened too quickly to radio. The Civil Aeronautics Board convened its formal hearing in early 1958. In the inquiry room, rows of officials listened to testimony from pilots, engineers, and meteorologists. The weather that night had been near perfect. Winds were light, visibility clear. No thunderstorms had been recorded anywhere along the route. There was no evidence of icing, lightning, or turbulence. Attention shifted to human factors. Could fatigue or disorientation have played a role? Captain Brown had flown this route many times. His logbook showed no irregularities. Crew rest schedules were within regulation. The medical review found no sign of impairment. Months passed, and every test reached the same dead end. The engines, when fragments were finally recovered, showed no evidence of explosion. The fuselage pieces displayed outward tearing in some areas, suggesting structural breakup on impact rather than in the air. The carbon monoxide readings remained the only unexplained clue. In private correspondence, some investigators speculated that exhaust gases from a failing engine could have entered the cabin through the air conditioning system, incapacitating the crew before they could act. Others suggested an unnoticed fire in the cargo bay producing toxic fumes. But both ideas relied on conditions impossible to prove without the main wreck. As the official investigation wound down, Pan Am engineers conducted internal simulations using the Stratocruiser's flight performance data. They concluded that if the aircraft had lost one or more engines and descended gradually over several minutes, it could have reached the water intact but at a steep angle, disintegrating on impact. That would explain both the life vests and the fatal injuries. The final report by the Civil Aeronautics Board, released in 1959, listed the cause as undetermined. It noted that the accident resulted from a loss of control for reasons unknown, and mentioned possible presence of carbon monoxide in the cockpit. With no evidence of sabotage, explosion or weather involvement, the file was closed. In later years, retired Pan Am employees revisited the tragedy. Many still called it the flight that died without a sound. The silence before the crash, no distress call, no warning, haunted the company for decades. The Boeing Stratocruiser fleet continued to operate until the early 1960s, but this event marked the end of its reputation for luxury and invincibility. US Navy Flight 19, TBM Avengers 1945, Atlantic, December 5, 1945. The war was over, but the skies above Florida were still filled with training flights from naval air stations. That afternoon, 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers lined up on the runway at Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station for a routine navigation and bombing exercise. It was called Flight 19. The mission was meant to last just over 2 hours. Each aircraft carried 3 men, a pilot, radioman and gunner, 15 in total. The lead pilot was Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, an experienced instructor and combat veteran of the Pacific. The weather was typical for Florida in December: scattered clouds, light winds and calm seas. The flight's route was simple, a triangle extending east over the Atlantic to the Bahamas, then north and finally back west toward Florida. The Avengers took off at 2:10 p.m. The exercise was known as Navigation Problem Number 1, and dozens of students had flown it before. For the first hour, everything went as planned. The formation dropped practice bombs over hens and chicken shoals east of Fort Lauderdale and turned north toward their second leg. But around 3 p.m, radio operators began to pick up strange transmissions. A pilot's voice came through the static. "This is an emergency. We seem to be off course." The voice belonged to Lieutenant Taylor. His tone was calm but uncertain. He reported that both of his compasses were malfunctioning. He believed they had drifted too far east, over the Florida Keys, and were now flying over the Gulf of Mexico. In reality, they were still far out over the Atlantic. Controllers at Fort Lauderdale tried to guide them back. They instructed Taylor to fly west, toward the mainland. But the messages were confused. Other pilots in the formation reported seeing no land at all, only endless water. One of them, Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Gerber, could be heard saying, "If we just fly west, we'll get home." But Taylor hesitated. His experience told him that if they were south of Florida, turning west would take them deeper into the Gulf. The radio traffic grew tangled. Some transmissions came clearly, others broke apart into bursts of static. One controller heard Taylor say, "We are not sure of our position. We can't make out land." Another voice cut in, "Everything looks wrong. Strange. The ocean doesn't look as it should." By 4 p.m, the Avengers had been airborne for nearly 2 hours. Fuel was running low, the flight's direction had shifted repeatedly. First east, then north, then west again. Controllers urged them to turn due west and fly until they reached Florida's coast. Taylor appeared to agree, then moments later changed course again, convinced he might be over the Bahamas. As the sun began to set, the confusion deepened. Thunderstorms were forming over the Atlantic. Radio signals grew weaker as the aircraft drifted farther from base. The last clear message received at Fort Lauderdale came at 6:20 p.m. Taylor's voice was faint but steady. "All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." Those were the last words of Flight 19. By nightfall, the Navy launched an emergency search. Dozens of aircraft scrambled from nearby bases. The first rescue plane, a Martin PBM Mariner carrying 13 men, took off from Banana River Naval Air Station at 7:27 p.m. It headed east along the route the Avengers were believed to have followed. 20 minutes later, a tanker ship in the area reported seeing an explosion in the sky. A large flash followed by flames on the water. The PBM had vanished. No wreckage or survivors from that aircraft were ever found. Through the night, search planes and ships scoured the sea, calling out over radio. No signal came back. The following morning, more than 200 aircraft and 21 ships joined the effort. They searched every mile between Florida and the Bahamas. Not a single piece of Flight 19 or the PBM was recovered. In the inquiry room at Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale, investigators laid out the sequence minute by minute. The records showed that Taylor's navigational problems began soon after leaving the bombing range. His compasses gave conflicting readings, possibly due to magnetic interference or a mechanical fault. Believing he was over the Florida Keys rather than the Atlantic, Taylor turned northeast, a fatal decision that took the formation farther out to sea. Radio logs revealed another problem. The Avengers were operating on different frequencies, making it difficult for all 5 aircraft to hear instructions from ground control. Several stations reported receiving fragments of conversation, but not full exchanges. Some of the other pilots had realized they were east of Florida, not south, and argued to turn west, but the chain of command kept them with the leader. Weather reports showed that by late afternoon, visibility had dropped sharply. Clouds obscured the horizon, and rain squalls moved in from the north. The combination of low visibility, faulty instruments, and failing radios created the perfect storm for disorientation. When the Board of Inquiry reviewed the case, they faced a maze of contradictions. No wreckage, no oil slick, no floating debris. Nothing tangible to confirm where the planes had gone down. The Atlantic in that region reaches depths of several thousand meters, and currents can scatter debris over wide distances. Experts reconstructed the possible final vector. Based on the last transmission and estimated fuel burn, the aircraft likely ran out of fuel around 7:30 p.m., roughly 120 miles east of Cape Canaveral. If they ditched together as Taylor had ordered, the planes would have hit the ocean in high seas at night, an almost unsurvivable situation. Forensic analysis of the missing PBM added another layer. The explosion witnessed by the tanker was consistent with a mid-air detonation of its fuel tanks, a known risk for the Mariner. Navy documents later noted that the model had a history of fuel vapor ignition, but without wreckage, the cause remained speculative. The inquiry report, released early the next year, listed the official verdict as cause unknown. It mentioned the likelihood of navigational error, compounded by weather and loss of radio communication. Lieutenant Taylor was not blamed directly. The Navy noted that his decision-making had been hampered by equipment failure and poor conditions. In the years that followed, Flight 19 became one of the most discussed disappearances in aviation history. Newspapers at the time described it as a lost patrol swallowed by the sea. The fact that a rescue plane also vanished on the same night fueled endless speculation, but in the records kept by controllers, the story remains a sequence of fading voices, the clipped professional tones of men trying to find their bearings over open ocean, static bursts interrupting words, conflicting reports from aircraft unsure of where they are, a final command to stay together, followed by silence. Airborne Transport DC-3, NC 16002, 1948, Caribbean, Miami San Juan. On the night of December 28, 1948, a Douglas DC-3 with registration NC 16002 sat on the tarmac at San Juan's Isla Grande Airport in Puerto Rico. The aircraft belonged to Airborne Transport Inc., a small charter company operating between Florida and the Caribbean. Its destination that night was Miami. On board were 29 people, 25 passengers and 4 crew, most of them returning home after the holidays. The pilot in command was Captain Robert Lindquist, a World War II veteran known for his calm precision. His co-pilot, Ernest Hill, was equally experienced. The flight was scheduled to leave at 10:30 p.m, but departure was delayed nearly an hour due to maintenance checks. The DC-3's batteries were weak, and ground crews had to recharge them. Mechanics also noted a faulty left landing gear indicator, but cleared the plane for takeoff after a manual inspection. At 10:39 p.m, the aircraft rolled down the runway and lifted into the dark Caribbean sky. The weather over San Juan was clear, but reports from the north showed patches of cloud and strong headwinds. The flight plan followed a direct route northwest across the Mona Passage, then along the southern edge of the Bahamas before turning toward Miami. The distance, about 1,100 miles, would take just over 5 hours. At 11:23 p.m, Captain Lindquist radioed San Juan control, over city of San Juan climbing to 8,500 feet, estimating Grand Turk at 1 o'clock. The transmission was clear and calm. Over the next 2 hours, the aircraft continued to send regular position reports. Everything seemed routine. At 12:30 a.m, the crew radioed that they were 50 miles south of Great Inagua Island, maintaining 8,500 feet. The voice sounded relaxed. The next scheduled call would be at 4:13 a.m. when the flight neared Miami's coastal range. It never came. 2 clocks began to diverge, one inside the cockpit counting down fuel and distance, and one on the ground ticking through every unanswered call. At 4:13 a.m, Miami Air Traffic Control attempted contact on the assigned frequency. No reply. The station kept calling, then switched to emergency channels, still nothing. Other aircraft in the area were asked to relay messages. None received a signal. By 4:40 a.m, with no radar trace and no radio contact, Flight 605 was declared overdue. Within hours, the US Coast Guard began searching. The route between Puerto Rico and Florida had seen hundreds of successful DC-3 crossings since the war, but it was also one of the most unpredictable stretches of ocean in aviation, filled with shifting winds, electrical storms, and strong magnetic fields. The search grid extended across the Bahamas, from Great Inagua to Miami. More than 50 aircraft and 18 ships participated. They found nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no sign of life. In the inquiry room at Miami, investigators gathered every piece of communication from the night. The flight's radio operator had logged 7 position reports, all accurate, all routine. The last one, sent around 4:13 a.m, indicated the DC-3 was about 50 miles south of Miami. The crew reported they would be arriving within 20 minutes. That was the final transmission. The next minute, the signal vanished. Forensics began with the aircraft itself. Maintenance records from San Juan showed that the DC-3's batteries had been nearly depleted before takeoff. Mechanics had noted that the aircraft could not operate its radio and navigation equipment simultaneously for long periods without external power. They recharged the batteries before departure, but the report warned that a full charge might not have been achieved. Investigators theorized that the plane's electrical system could have failed en route. If the batteries drained, the radios and navigation lights would have gone dead. The crew, flying at night over open ocean, might have lost both communication and instrument lighting. But that still didn't explain why no emergency call was made. The DC-3's radio had a backup circuit. The pilots were trained to switch to it instantly in case of failure. Another possibility was fuel exhaustion. The headwinds that night were stronger than forecast, up to 40 knots in some areas. If the aircraft had encountered those winds for several hours, it might have run out of fuel before reaching the coast. In that case, it would have ditched in the dark waters somewhere short of Florida. But search planes flying the area at sunrise saw no floating wreckage, not even a fuel slick. Meteorologists reviewed the weather logs. No storms were reported along the route. Visibility over the Bahamas remained good until early morning, when scattered low clouds formed near the Florida Straits. Lightning was rare, and turbulence was light. The ocean was calm. Whatever happened to Flight 605, it was not caused by weather. Inside the inquiry room, the 2 clocks continued to define the investigation. The first, the flight clock, measured the expected time of arrival based on the aircraft's performance and fuel burn. The second, the search clock, marked every hour that passed without discovery. On paper, the time seemed straightforward. The aircraft had enough fuel for about 7 hours. It disappeared 5 hours after takeoff. That meant if it had gone down, it did so well within range of the Miami coastline. Yet nothing appeared. Engineers from Douglas Aircraft analysed the maintenance records and concluded that the electrical issues, while serious, were not likely to cause immediate catastrophe. The DC-3 could fly safely even without power, though it would lose its radio and some instruments. Pilots often used visual navigation over the ocean at night, relying on celestial cues or distant lights. But if the crew had drifted off course due to wind or magnetic deviation, they might have flown into open water north of the Bahamas without realising it. The final radio message from the aircraft mentioned being 50 miles south of Miami. That position, if accurate, would have placed the DC-3 within range of radar or visual detection by coastal observers. None reported seeing or hearing anything unusual. The Navy conducted underwater listening operations off the Florida Keys but found no trace. As the search stretched into its second week, investigators explored a disturbing possibility that the position reports themselves might have been wrong. The DC-3's navigation system relied on low-frequency radio beacons. With weak batteries, the receivers could have misread or miscalculated bearing signals, placing the aircraft hundreds of miles off its intended course. If the pilots believed they were approaching Miami when they were still over the open Atlantic, their descent could have been fatal. When the final report was drafted, the Civil Aeronautics Authority summarized the facts. The aircraft departed San Juan at 10:39 p.m., carrying 29 people. It made regular position reports until the last at 4:13 a.m., estimating arrival in 20 minutes. Weather was favourable. No distress call was heard, no wreckage was found. Cause undetermined. In private notes, some investigators added their own conclusions. One wrote, "Probable fuel exhaustion followed by ditching." Another wrote, "Electrical failure leading to total radio silence." Both explanations could fit. Neither could be proven. The case became one of the earliest aviation mysteries linked to what would later be called the Bermuda Triangle, though in 1948 no one used that term. For the families waiting at Miami Airport that morning, the scene was one of disbelief. Passengers' relatives lined the terminal, watching the clock tick past the arrival time. Hours later, officials confirmed what they feared. Flight 605 had vanished somewhere over the Caribbean, leaving no signal, no wreck, and no survivors. Canadian Pacific Airlines Flight 3505, DC-4, 1951, Gulf of Alaska. On July 21, 1951, a Douglas DC-4 operated by Canadian Pacific Airlines lifted off from Vancouver Airport just before midnight. The 4-engine aircraft, registered CFCPC, was designated Flight 3505. Its destination was Tokyo, with planned stops in Anchorage and Shemya, a remote island in the Aleutian chain. On board were 31 passengers and 6 crew, 37 people in total. The route was familiar to Canadian Pacific pilots, part of a growing post-war network linking North America to Asia. The night was clear over British Columbia. Flight 3505 climbed to cruising altitude, heading northwest along the coast before crossing into Alaska. The crew transmitted position and weather reports at regular intervals, as required for long overwater flights. Each message was calm, routine, and by the book. The captain, R.S. Wallace, was an experienced flyer with more than 10,000 hours logged, including extensive Arctic and Pacific routes. The first leg to Anchorage covered roughly 1,350 miles. Shortly after 3:30 a.m., Anchorage radio received a transmission from Flight 3505. The aircraft was flying at 8,000 feet, maintaining steady course, and expected to arrive around 4:25 a.m. The weather report from the crew noted only light turbulence and patchy clouds. Everything sounded normal. It was the last confirmed contact. At 4:25 a.m, the estimated arrival time passed. Controllers at Anchorage tried to raise the aircraft. There was no response. They repeated calls on multiple frequencies. Nothing. When the DC-4 failed to appear on radar, primitive at the time but still effective within a limited range, Anchorage declared an alert. Within hours, the US Air Force, Coast Guard and Canadian authorities mobilized a joint search. The search area stretched from the British Columbia coastline to the Gulf of Alaska, a vast and rugged region of mountains, fjords, and deep ocean. The Gulf's waters are cold, restless, and often covered by fog even in summer. Over the following days, weather in the area worsened, with winds up to 40 knots and low visibility hampering operations. Rescue aircraft flew grid patterns, focusing first on the segment between Sitka and Yakutat, the section corresponding to the aircraft's last reported position. The US Coast Guard sent cutters and patrol boats along the coast. By the end of the first day, no trace had been found. The inquiry room at Anchorage was soon covered in maps marked with coloured pins and coordinates. Investigators reconstructed the flight's last known vector. Based on the timing of the final report, the DC-4 was believed to be about 90 miles south of Yakutat, heading toward Anchorage over open water. If it had crashed along that route, debris should have surfaced quickly. None did. The Gulf of Alaska, however, is one of the deepest parts of the continental margin, reaching depths of 15,000 feet. If the aircraft had gone down intact, it could have sunk in minutes, leaving little to float, but rescuers expected at least some evidence: seat cushions, oil slicks, papers, or life rafts. The total absence of debris confused everyone involved. At Canadian Pacific headquarters in Vancouver, company officials reviewed maintenance and crew records. The DC-4 had completed a recent inspection and was in good condition. The engines had been overhauled the previous month, and no mechanical problems were reported during takeoff or climb. The crew was well rested. Captain Wallace had flown the same route several times. Radio operators along the Alaska coast were interviewed. Some reported faint signals after the final scheduled message, but none could be verified. Static and atmospheric interference are common in the northern latitudes, where magnetic fields distort radio waves. The Civil Aeronautics Administration determined that no confirmed messages were received after 3:30 a.m. By the fifth day, more than 40 aircraft and 12 surface vessels were involved in the search. They covered 16,000 square miles, from the Canadian border to Kodiak Island. Weather patterns shifted daily, alternating between fog, drizzle, and sun. Pilots flying low along the shoreline scanned for metallic reflections or oil sheens. On the sixth day, one crew spotted what appeared to be a patch of discoloured water off Yakutat Bay. Ships moved in but found only natural oil from decaying organic matter. The investigators then considered possible causes. Mechanical failure remained the leading theory. A sudden fire or engine explosion could have destroyed the aircraft before a distress call was made. But the DC-4's design made total loss of communications unlikely. Even if an engine failed, the aircraft could still fly on 3, sometimes 2 engines. Crew training required immediate radio reporting of any emergency. Weather analysis from the US Weather Bureau suggested moderate icing conditions in some upper layers that night. Ice buildup on wings and propellers could have reduced lift or caused stall. However, icing usually develops gradually, and crews are trained to descend or de-ice before reaching critical levels. The last weather report from the aircraft mentioned no icing or instability. The investigation also explored navigation error. Magnetic deviations near the Gulf of Alaska sometimes affected compass readings. If the crew had followed a slightly incorrect bearing, they might have strayed far offshore or even toward the mountainous terrain east of Anchorage. Search planes swept inland valleys and glacier fields, but found no sign of impact or wreckage. In the inquiry room, investigators began calculating the probable fuel exhaustion point. The DC-4 carried enough fuel for about 9 hours. The last report came roughly 3 hours after takeoff. If the plane continued flying beyond its expected route due to navigational error, it could have run out of fuel around dawn, possibly hundreds of miles from where searchers were looking. By the end of July, the operation had covered nearly 50,000 square miles of ocean and land. The Coast Guard called off the search on August 2nd. No debris, no bodies, no oil slicks had ever been found. For the families of the 37 on board, it was as if the aircraft had vanished into thin air. Back in Vancouver, the Civil Aeronautics Board assembled all the data. Departure time 10:35, PM Pacific, altitude 8,000 feet, last contact 3:30 a.m, Alaska time, position south of Yakutat, weather fair, radio working normally, and a routine tone in the pilot's voice. The timeline ended abruptly. The board classified the disappearance as missing or presumed lost over water. Without wreckage, no probable cause could be determined. In later reviews, engineers suggested that a fire, structural failure, or severe icing could have brought down the aircraft rapidly. But with no evidence, each theory remained speculation. Years later, pilots flying similar routes reported spotting metallic reflections in remote fjords along the Alaska coast, but every lead ended without result. Glacier movements, avalanches, and the sheer depth of the sea made recovery impossible. On the route map in the inquiry office, the red line of Flight 3505 still runs northwest from Vancouver, curving across the Gulf toward Anchorage. It stops abruptly near a blank section of ocean, the point of last contact. Every hour of that flight was accounted for, every position report logged precisely until the final one, where all data stopped and the open sea began. The search grid stretched endlessly in all directions, from mountains to the deep Pacific, but the coordinates never led to anything more than fog, cold wind, and the empty sound of engines that had once filled the night sky, before falling silent somewhere over the Gulf of Alaska. Pan Am Hawaii Clipper, Martin M130, 1938, Western Pacific. On the morning of July 28, 1938, Pan American Airways Hawaii Clipper departed from Guam, heading west toward Manila, the final leg of its trans-Pacific journey from San Francisco. The aircraft was a Martin M130 flying boat, one of only 3 ever built, and at the time one of the most advanced passenger aircraft in the world. It carried 6 passengers and 9 crew members, including veteran Captain Leonard Teletsky, a pilot with thousands of flight hours logged across the Pacific. The weather was good. Visibility was excellent. The Hawaii Clipper lifted off from Agana Harbour at 11:39 a.m., engines smooth, propellers glinting in the tropical sun. The flight was scheduled to last about 6 hours, covering 1,600 kilometers of open ocean between Guam and Manila. The route followed a line of navigation beacons and islands used regularly by Pan Am's famous China Clipper service. At 12:27 p.m, the aircraft made its first scheduled position report. Everything normal, altitude 9,000 feet, course 281 degrees. The radio operator signed off routinely. At 3:03 p.m, another position report came through. The Hawaii Clipper was about 565 miles from Manila. Weather conditions were described as good, with scattered cumulus clouds and light winds. The next report, due around 3:30, never arrived. In Manila's Pan American radio office, the operator tried repeatedly to contact the aircraft. There was no response. At first, they assumed a temporary communication issue. The aircraft's flight path crossed regions of poor radio propagation, and brief silences were not unusual. But as the minutes turned into hours, tension grew. The aircraft was due to land at Manila Bay by 5:30 p.m. At 6 o'clock, still no contact. 2 clocks began ticking in opposite directions. The flight clock inside the cockpit counting down fuel and daylight, and the search clock on the ground marking each silent minute past the scheduled arrival. By 7 p.m, Pan Am declared the aircraft overdue. The US Navy and Philippine authorities were alerted, and search operations began before nightfall. At dawn, Navy patrol boats and seaplanes fanned out across the route between Guam and Manila. The sea was calm, visibility excellent. The search grid stretched for hundreds of miles. On the second day, a merchant ship, the SS Phoebus, reported finding an oil slick near the aircraft's expected track. Samples were collected and tested, but results were inconclusive. No debris, no wreckage, no life rafts were ever found. In the inquiry room at Manila, Pan American and US Navy investigators began reconstructing the sequence of events. The Hawaii Clipper had sent clear, consistent position reports up to its final one. Its flight path placed it almost exactly halfway between Guam and Manila, over some of the deepest waters in the Western Pacific. The radio operator's last message carried no hint of trouble. The aircraft's maintenance logs were reviewed. The Martin M130 with registration NC 14714 had been serviced just days before in San Francisco. All 4 Pratt & Whitney engines were in excellent condition. The flight engineer's pre-departure checklist showed no abnormalities. There were no weather systems, storms or typhoons in the region that day. Investigators began examining mechanical failure scenarios. A sudden structural failure or engine explosion could have destroyed the aircraft instantly. But the M130's design was robust. and even with one engine out, it could maintain flight. A ditching, while dangerous, was considered survivable in calm seas. The complete absence of floating debris made such a scenario unlikely. Attention turned to the human element. Captain Teletsky was known for caution and professionalism. He'd flown the Pacific route dozens of times. His crew was equally seasoned. Nothing in their records suggested error or fatigue. One of the first theories proposed was sabotage. The Hawaii Clipper had departed from Manila earlier that week carrying a large amount of US currency, part of payments and mail related to business operations in Asia. When it took off from Guam, officials confirmed that similar valuable cargo was on board. Some speculated that hijacking or theft might have played a role. Reports later surfaced that certain passengers were Japanese businessmen travelling under ambiguous circumstances. The timing, 1938 during rising tensions in the Pacific, gave the story weight. In the inquiry room, Navy investigators examined the possibility of forced diversion. Could the aircraft have been seized and redirected to another location? The range of the M130 was roughly 3,200 miles, enough to reach parts of the Philippines, Taiwan, or Japanese-controlled islands if commandeered. But radio silence and lack of wreckage made that theory impossible to confirm. The two clocks theory, the one of flight time and the one of search delay, became central to the investigation. Based on fuel consumption, the Hawaii Clipper should have been airborne for about 7 hours total. Its last transmission came 3 hours before that limit. That meant that if an emergency occurred soon after the last report, the aircraft might have ditched within an hour. Yet the search operations reached the area within that same time frame. No distress signal had been heard, and no flares were sighted. Engineers reviewed radio records for possible signs of interference. Transmissions from the Hawaii Clipper were strong and clear until the moment they stopped. Atmospheric data showed no solar disturbance or electrical storm that could have blocked communications. Investigators considered the possibility of fire. An in-flight fire could explain sudden loss of contact. However, if the aircraft had burned mid-air, debris and floating wreckage should have been found. Oil residue recovered by the SS Phoebus lacked traces of fuel or lubricants associated with aircraft systems. Weeks passed. The US Navy extended the search west toward Luzon and south toward Mindanao. They deployed seaplanes, destroyers, and merchant vessels. Not a single confirmed item from the Hawaii Clipper was ever recovered. The search was officially called off on August 5, 1938. The inquiry convened at Manila's Army and Navy Club that month. Representatives from Pan American, the US Navy, and the Bureau of Air Commerce reviewed all available data. Charts of the flight's final position were pinned to the walls. The inquiry concluded that the aircraft disappeared over the Western Pacific for reasons unknown. The report listed the last known position as 791 miles from Guam, 582 miles from Manila, at 3:03 p.m. local time. Privately, some officials continued to suspect hijacking. One theory, later mentioned in press accounts, claimed that the crew might have been forced to land on a Japanese-controlled island such as Truk or Yap. No evidence ever surfaced to support that claim, and after the war, when Allied forces occupied those islands, no trace of the aircraft was found. In Washington, Pan Am engineers analysed flight performance data and possible failure modes. The M130 had an excellent safety record. The probability of a simultaneous loss of engines or catastrophic breakup was statistically low. A more plausible cause, they noted, could have been mechanical failure leading to gradual loss of altitude. Perhaps a slow fuel leak or navigation error that caused the aircraft to drift far off course before fuel exhaustion. In the absence of evidence, the official record remained unchanged. The Hawaii Clipper had left Guam at 11:39 a.m., sent its last transmission at 3:03 p.m., and never arrived in Manila. The estimated time of disappearance was around 4 p.m. In the Manila radio log, the final entry sits alone. 15:30, no further contact. The flight clock stopped somewhere over the Pacific, while the search clock kept running for 9 long days, ticking through empty skies and calm water. Between those two timelines lies one of aviation's oldest unsolved mysteries. A routine flight that followed every rule, made every call, and then simply ceased to exist over a stretch of ocean too deep and too far to ever give anything back. Skyways York G-AFE, 1953, North Atlantic, February 2, 1953. Just after midnight, an Avro York 4-engine transport aircraft belonging to the British charter company Skyways Limited, prepared to leave Layes Field in the Azores. The aircraft registration GA8FA had made a brief stop for refuelling on its way from Stansted, England to Jamaica, with an onward leg to Bermuda. It was a familiar route for Skyways crews supporting post-war troop transport and cargo missions. The York carried 33 people in total, 6 crew members and 27 passengers, mostly Royal Air Force personnel and their families heading to new postings overseas. At 0:31 GMT, the York lifted off from the Azores runway into a moonless sky. The aircraft climbed steadily to its cruising altitude of 9,000 feet, heading west across the North Atlantic. The weather was good with scattered clouds and light winds. The crew reported in briefly to Layes Control, confirming departure and flight level. Everything appeared normal. For the next few hours, radio contact was intermittent but routine. The aircraft's operator filed scheduled reports through Atlantic radio stations, as was standard procedure. The estimated flight time to Gander, Newfoundland for refueling was around 8 hours. At 4:10 GMT, roughly halfway across the Atlantic, the first sign of trouble appeared. Morse operators at Layes picked up a short message from the aircraft's radio. Urgency call, engine trouble. A few seconds later came an SOS, then silence. The transmission broke off mid-message. Attempts to raise the aircraft on all frequencies failed. The message was logged immediately, and the final vector of the York was calculated from its last known position, approximately 300 miles north-northeast of the Azores, over open ocean. The aircraft was well within range of multiple radio stations, yet no further signal was ever received. Within an hour, the US Air Force and Royal Air Force organised a search operation. Long-range patrol aircraft from the Azores and Layes were launched before dawn. Ships in the North Atlantic convoy routes were alerted to keep watch for flares or floating debris. Weather at the time was relatively clear, though light rain and low clouds moved in later that morning. At 8:20 GMT, a US Air Force C-54 reported spotting an oil slick on the surface of the ocean, roughly along the missing aircraft's route. Several other aircraft confirmed similar patches in the area. Search vessels were directed to the coordinates, but when they arrived hours later, strong winds and currents had already dispersed the slick. No wreckage or identifiable debris was found. In the inquiry room at London's Ministry of Civil Aviation, investigators began assembling the timeline. The Avro York had left the Azores with a full load of fuel, checked and cleared for the long oceanic crossing. Maintenance logs showed no outstanding mechanical issues. The captain, Geoffrey Bennett, had over 7,000 flying hours and was experienced on transatlantic routes. The radio operator, John Rogers, had logged all frequencies properly before departure. The initial theory was engine failure. The York's 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines were powerful but temperamental, and several aircraft of the type had suffered power loss in previous years. Losing one engine at altitude was manageable, but 2 or more on the same wing could be catastrophic. The urgency call mentioning engine trouble supported this scenario. Yet even in the case of multiple failures, the crew would have had time to send a full SOS and relay their position. The abrupt cut-off suggested something far more sudden. The second possibility considered was electrical failure. If a fire or short circuit had affected the aircraft's main power bus, both radio and navigation systems could have failed simultaneously. But again, this would not explain the oil slicks later observed, evidence that fuel or lubricants had leaked into the ocean. Forensic examination of the oil samples taken from the Atlantic was inconclusive. Analysis showed the substance to be consistent with aircraft fuel oil, but contamination from ship traffic in the area made results uncertain. Investigators could not definitively link the slick to the Skyways York. In the days following the disappearance, the search effort grew into one of the largest in the North Atlantic since the war. US Navy aircraft flew more than 90 sorties. RAF Coastal Command units joined from Gibraltar and the Azores, scanning a combined area of over 40,000 square miles. On the third day, another aircraft reported seeing what looked like small fragments of debris, possibly wood or light metal, floating 320 miles north of the Azores. When ships arrived at the site, nothing remained. The final vector of the flight was reconstructed using radio bearings from 3 ground stations. Triangulation placed the aircraft roughly along the Great Circle route between Layes and Gander. If the engines had failed in sequence, the York might have attempted a controlled ditching. The seas were moderate that morning, and a successful ditching would have been possible. But even then, life rafts, seat cushions, or fuselage parts should have floated. The complete lack of such evidence confounded search teams. In the inquiry room, aviation engineers from Avro and the Ministry of Supply studied the York's mechanical design. The aircraft had been built during World War II as a military transport derived from the Lancaster bomber. It was sturdy but not pressurized, and its electrical and fuel systems were complex. One vulnerability was the fuel crossfeed mechanism that allowed balancing between tanks. A leak or valve malfunction could lead to fire or explosion if vapors ignited near the engines. Witnesses from Skyways maintenance staff testified that the aircraft had recently undergone service and fuel tank inspection. No defects were noted. Captain Bennett's record was exemplary. He'd flown for Skyways for several years without incident. The ministry examined meteorological data next. On that morning, a cold front extended across the North Atlantic, producing occasional turbulence and scattered showers. Upper air winds were strong but not hazardous. Pilots in nearby aircraft reported no severe icing or electrical storms. Conditions were described as uneventful. The investigation then turned to the radio sequence itself, the only solid piece of evidence. The first Morse transmission had been marked QQQ, an older code signalling urgency. Moments later, a full SOS was keyed. Then the transmission stopped mid-word. The operator never repeated it. To radio experts, that indicated a power loss or sudden physical interruption, such as an explosion or catastrophic breakup. The Avro York carried no pressurized oxygen tanks or hazardous cargo that might have triggered an explosion, but it did have high-octane fuel lines running close to the electrical wiring near the wing roots. In 1949, another York had been lost due to a fuel system fire, originating in the same area. The Skyways inquiry compared those cases but could not find enough parallels to confirm a pattern. For weeks, the North Atlantic remained under surveillance. Oil slicks continued to appear and disappear. One US destroyer retrieved a small plank of wood coated with paint similar to the York's cabin trim, but tests were inconclusive. The sea kept its secrets. By late February, the search was suspended. The official Ministry of Civil Aviation report stated simply that the aircraft was presumed lost over the North Atlantic following transmission of an SOS. The probable cause, failure of one or more engines leading to loss of control, nature undetermined. In London, relatives of those on board gathered at Skyways offices to receive the report. Among the passengers were families of service members, engineers, and 2 children. None of their remains were ever found. In the final documentation, the radio log remained stark. 0410, urgency call received, engine trouble reported. 0413, SOS received, transmission incomplete. End of contact. The oil slick coordinates are circled on the search charts, one of the few physical clues ever recorded. They mark the last known vector of Skyways Avro York GAA, a point in the North Atlantic where a calm flight turned silent in seconds, leaving only a broken radio message, a few drifting patches of oil, and the unanswered question of what happened in the moments after that final, interrupted call. Cessna 210 VHMDX, 1981, Barrington Tops, Australia. On August 9, 1981, a single-engine Cessna 210 Centurion, registration VHMDX, taxied along the runway at Coolangatta Airport on Australia's Gold Coast. The aircraft was bound for Bankstown, in Sydney's southwest, a routine flight of roughly 400 miles. On board were 5 people, pilot Michael Hutchins and 4 passengers returning from a business trip. The weather over Queensland was fair, but reports farther south painted a different picture. Cold fronts moving through New South Wales, low cloud and freezing rain over the Great Dividing Range. At 6:10 p.m, the Cessna took off and climbed steadily to 10,000 feet. Radio contact with Brisbane Air Traffic Control was established soon after departure. Hutchins, 31 years old and an experienced private pilot, reported normal conditions as the flight tracked south along the coastline. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. The aircraft's flight plan indicated it would pass inland near Newcastle before descending towards Sydney. At 7:06 p.m, while cruising over northern New South Wales, Hutchins contacted Air Traffic Control again. His voice was calm but slightly strained. "We're picking up icing," he said. Controllers advised him to descend to avoid the freezing layer. The pilot acknowledged and began lowering altitude. The aircraft was now entering cloud layers forming along the ridges of the Barrington Tops, a rugged mountain area 200 kilometres north of Sydney, known for dense rainforest, steep slopes and unpredictable weather. Minutes later, Hutchins radioed again. "I'm having trouble maintaining altitude," he said. "We've got severe turbulence." Controllers instructed him to turn east toward the coast, where weather was clearer. Hutchins attempted the turn, but soon reported that his instruments were malfunctioning. "My artificial horizons toppled," he said, referring to the gyroscopic instrument that keeps the pilot aware of the aircraft's orientation. Without it, flying in cloud becomes extremely difficult. At 7:20 p.m, the pilot's voice came through again. "We're now at 5,000 feet and I can't maintain heading." Those were his last known words. The transmission ended abruptly. Repeated calls from controllers went unanswered. Radar contact vanished moments later. The first search aircraft was dispatched within an hour. Controllers calculated the likely area of disappearance near the Barrington Tops Plateau, between Scone and Gloucester. The terrain there rises steeply to 5,000 feet, covered in thick temperate forest and deep ravines. Nightfall and heavy rain made immediate search impossible. By morning, helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft began scanning the area. The search grid quickly expanded. The Cessna 210 had no emergency locator transmitter, which meant no distress beacon to home in on. Crews relied on the last radar fix and radio bearings from Hutchins' transmissions. Those pointed to a region about 40 kilometres northwest of Dungog. Visibility was poor. Clouds hugged the ridges, and freezing drizzle coated the trees. Day after day, helicopters from the Royal Australian Air Force and local police scoured the mountains. Ground teams battled mud, dense undergrowth, and near vertical slopes. The conditions were so difficult that searchers described the forest as almost impenetrable. Heavy fog often grounded aircraft. The Barrington Tops are known for rapid weather changes, one moment clear, the next completely white. By the end of the first week, no trace of VHMDX had been found. Search coordinators plotted every known clue on large wall maps. The flight's last vector from radar, the final altitude of 5,000 feet, the terrain elevations and weather data. The overlap pointed to a narrow zone west of Mount Barrington. Still, each grid section turned up nothing. The inquiry room at Newcastle became the operations nerve centre. Meteorologists confirmed that icing conditions had been severe that night. Freezing rain and supercooled cloud droplets were present between 6,000 and 9,000 feet. When ice accumulates on an aircraft's wings, it distorts airflow, reducing lift and increasing drag. The Cessna 210 was not equipped with de-icing boots or heated propellers. In those conditions, control loss can happen within minutes. Investigators also analysed the radio transcripts. The sequence showed a rapid escalation of problems: icing, turbulence, instrument failure, disorientation. Hutchins had followed procedures correctly, reporting altitude and attempting to turn towards safer airspace. But once his artificial horizon failed, he was effectively blind inside cloud. Without external reference points, even experienced pilots can suffer spatial disorientation, a phenomenon where the inner ear misinterprets motion, causing the pilot to believe the aircraft is level when it is not. If VHMDX entered a spiral descent in the dark, surrounded by cloud, it could have impacted the terrain at high speed. The dense forest canopy might have absorbed the wreckage, leaving little visible from the air. Search teams continued through late August. The operation became one of the largest in Australian civil aviation history. At its peak, more than 50 aircraft and 300 people were involved. Helicopters dropped flares at night to illuminate valleys. Every possible route the aircraft might have taken was explored: north toward Tamworth, east toward the coast, and south toward the Hunter Valley. No wreckage was found. When the official search was suspended after 10 days, private volunteers kept looking. Bushwalkers, farmers, and pilots joined the effort, combing creeks and ridgelines on foot. The Royal Australian Air Force conducted further sweeps during the following weeks using radar-equipped aircraft. Nothing appeared. Back in the inquiry room, investigators compared the final transmissions with radar plots. The last radar return placed the Cessna descending near 5,000 feet, heading roughly south-southeast. That altitude corresponded almost exactly to the height of the surrounding peaks. In clear conditions, Hutchins might have seen the terrain and avoided it. In solid cloud, there was no chance. The timing of the last message, 7:20 p.m, matched a point when the aircraft would have been directly over the highest ridges of the Barrington Plateau. Forensic analysts studied the possibility of an in-flight breakup. The Cessna 210 structure was strong, but prolonged icing combined with turbulence could overstress the airframe. A wing failure or stall in those conditions would have been catastrophic. With no wreckage recovered, however, the cause could not be proven. As months passed, snow covered the higher slopes, ending any further ground search. Families of those on board returned to the area the following summer, funding independent expeditions. They found fragments of old wrecks from previous decades, but nothing belonging to VHMDX. In 1983, 2 years after the disappearance, a new search using aerial photography and satellite mapping was launched. It identified several potential impact zones, but dense forest and steep gullies prevented access. Again, no discovery. Over the following decades, small volunteer teams and bushwalkers occasionally reported metallic glints or unusual clearings. Each lead was checked by police and aviation authorities. None yielded results. By the 1990s, the wreck of VHMDX had become part of Australian aviation legend, the only known mainland crash site never found. Investigators maintained that the aircraft most likely struck terrain in the Barrington Tops area shortly after 7:20 p.m. on August 9, 1981. The evidence pointed to icing, instrument failure, and loss of control in cloud. The search grid, despite covering more than 8,000 square kilometres, had not revealed even a single identifiable piece of debris. Today, the official file remains open, labelled Aircraft Presumed Destroyed, Location Unknown. In the radio logs preserved by Air Services Australia, the final entries are still visible. 1910, pilot reports severe icing. 1916, request descent. 1919, artificial horizon failed. 1920, last message, altitude 5,000 feet. Beyond that, there is silence. Somewhere among the cold ridges and mist of the Barrington Tops, hidden beneath decades of forest growth, lies the final vector of VHMDX. The point where the aircraft fell off the radar, the radio went quiet, and Australia's only unrecovered mainland crash vanished into the wilderness. Indian Air Force and 32, 2016, Bay of Bengal. On the morning of July 22, 2016, an Indian Air Force Antonov An-32 transport aircraft rolled down the runway at Tambaram Air Force Station near Chennai. The twin-engine turboprop was on a routine supply mission to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, more than 1,200 kilometres away across the Bay of Bengal. On board were 29 people, 6 crew members, several Air Force and Navy personnel, and 4 civilians. The flight, numbered K2743, was scheduled to take off at 8:30 a.m. and land at Port Blair around 11:45. The AN-32 was one of the workhorses of the Indian Air Force. Designed in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, it was built to handle tough conditions, mountain bases, desert airstrips, and tropical humidity. The aircraft had made the Chennai-Port Blair run countless times before. That morning, the weather briefing mentioned patchy cloud and light rain, but nothing out of the ordinary. At 8:30 a.m, the aircraft lifted off and climbed to cruising altitude, tracking southeast over the bay. Its expected route was a straight line across open water, with radio check-ins at regular intervals. At 8:46, the pilot reported passing waypoint Podag, confirming everything was normal. The aircraft levelled at 23,000 feet and continued on course. At 9:12 a.m, radar controllers at Chennai observed the An-32 turning slightly left from its assigned track, a routine movement possibly to avoid a cloud build-up. Moments later, the radar trace faded. Air traffic control tried calling. There was no response. The secondary radar return FET, which relies on the aircraft's transponder, disappeared completely. The 2 clocks began ticking at that instant, one in the cockpit counting down fuel and flight time, wherever the aircraft might still have been, the other on the ground counting each minute without contact. Controllers at Chennai declared an emergency at 9:17. The last radar position was 151 nautical miles east of Chennai, over deep ocean. the Indian Navy immediately dispatched P-8Y Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, Dornier search planes and several ships. The Bay of Bengal's weather had changed rapidly, now overcast, with towering cumulus and rain squalls forming along the route. By early afternoon, Navy ships reached the coordinates of the last radar fix. The surface conditions were rough, with waves reaching 4 to 5 meters. Visibility dropped as rain swept across the area. Nothing was seen. The search continued into the night, with ships maintaining a line abreast formation, scanning by floodlight. The next morning, the full weight of India's search and rescue infrastructure came into action. 21 ships, including destroyers and survey vessels, joined the effort. Airborne assets from the Navy and Air Force flew more than 150 sorties over the next several days. The search area expanded to 120,000 square kilometers. In the inquiry room at Air Headquarters in New Delhi, investigators pieced together the timeline. The AN-32's last transmission had been routine. No distress signal, no technical issue reported. The radar trace showed a slow descent, consistent with a controlled flight rather than a catastrophic breakup. But there was no sign of life rafts, fuel slicks, or floating debris. The Bay of Bengal in that sector reaches depths of 3,000 meters, one of the least explored parts of India's maritime zone. Strong currents flow northeast from the equator, capable of dispersing wreckage over vast distances. The monsoon season added to the difficulty, with poor visibility, crosswinds, and shifting wave patterns. The aircraft's track was plotted on a large map in the operations center. Its last known position formed the center of an expanding spiral, representing the likely drift of debris over time. Search grids were assigned to aircraft and ships in sectors extending east, south, and northwest. The first 72 hours were critical. After that, survival chances for anyone in the water would fall sharply. At 10:30 a.m. on July 23rd, a Navy helicopter spotted what appeared to be a floating object roughly 80 kilometers from the last known point. A ship was directed to investigate, but when it arrived 2 hours later, the object had vanished beneath the surface. Sonar scans detected nothing unusual. Back at Chennai, families of those on board gathered at the base waiting for news. The list of missing included pilot squadron leader Vinod and flight lieutenant Shubham, along with airmen, naval engineers, and civilian technicians. All had flown the route before. Technicians reviewed maintenance logs. The aircraft had undergone scheduled servicing weeks earlier and was cleared for long-distance operations. The AN-32's engines, Ivchenko AI-20 turboprops, were known to be reliable, though aging. The Air Force operated around 100 of the type, most delivered in the 1980s. Investigators from the Directorate of Flight Safety began exploring possible causes. The first was mechanical failure, a mid-air engine fire or structural issue, but the absence of any distress call made this unlikely. Pilots are trained to declare Mayday even with seconds to spare. The second theory focused on weather. The route crossed a region of strong convective activity that morning. Satellite imagery showed massive cloud towers rising to 35,000 feet. If the aircraft entered one of these cells, it could have faced severe turbulence and downdrafts powerful enough to exceed design limits. The third theory involved instrument failure. The AN-32's analog flight instruments, vulnerable to moisture and icing, might have malfunctioned in heavy weather, causing spatial disorientation. In such conditions, a crew can lose control without realizing the aircraft's true attitude. A steep, accelerating descent from altitude could have occurred in under a minute, leaving no time for transmission. At the Joint Operations Command Center in New Delhi, Navy hydrographers analyzed sonar maps of the seabed. The last known position lay over a deep trench with rugged contours. The depth, over 3 kilometers, made sonar mapping difficult. Specialized submersibles were requested from abroad, but the process would take weeks. By the 5th day, the search area had doubled. The Indian Space Research Organization joined with satellite imaging, looking for fuel slicks or large floating debris. Nothing conclusive appeared. Meanwhile, the search clock kept running. Each new day required recalculating drift and adjusting coordinates. Ships steamed in grid patterns, each covering assigned zones twice. The crew logged every sighting, driftwood, fishing gear, containers, but none matched aircraft material. By July 31st, the mission had covered nearly 300,000 square kilometers. The Navy announced that all possible visual searches were complete. The next phase would focus on underwater detection. In August, a sonar vessel conducted deep-sea sweeps across the last known location. High-resolution soundings revealed several anomalies on the seabed, but none showed definitive aircraft signatures. The depth, combined with sediment and strong currents, made recovery almost impossible with existing equipment. The official inquiry concluded that the aircraft had likely gone down rapidly after loss of control, possibly due to weather or mechanical failure. With no wreckage recovered, the cause remained undetermined. In 2017, the Indian government confirmed that all 29 on board were presumed dead. A memorial was erected at the Air Force Base in Chennai, listing the names of the crew and passengers. The final minutes of the flight remain a void, a point on radar, a faint trace fading into the background noise of the bay. The flight clock ended sometime around 9:15 that morning, somewhere over deep water. The search clock ran for more than 300 hours before the operation was called off. Even today, the loss of the AN-32 over the Bay of Bengal stands as one of India's greatest unsolved aviation mysteries. In the Air Force's archive flight log, the last entries are clear and routine. 0846, position report received. 0912, radar contact lost. 0917, declared overdue. After that, silence. No beacon, no wreck, no survivors. Just a coordinate on a chart marking where two clocks was, one in the air, one on the sea, stopped ticking together. Frederick Valentich, Cessna 182L, 1978, Bass Strait, October 21st, 1978. The sun was setting over the southern coast of Australia as a young pilot named Frederick Valentich prepared for a routine flight. He was 20 years old, licensed and ambitious, with dreams of joining the Royal Australian Air Force someday. His aircraft, a Cessna 182L, registered VHDSJ, was a sturdy single-engine plane built for short-range travel. That evening he planned to fly from Moorabbin Airport near Melbourne to King Island, located in the Bass Strait, a 125 nautical mile trip that should have taken about an hour. Valentich filed his flight plan at 5:23 p.m. The weather forecast was good, clear visibility with light winds. He departed Moorabbin at 6:19 p.m, heading southwest at 4,500 feet. His voice on the radio sounded calm, professional and confident. For the first 40 minutes, nothing unusual was reported. Air traffic controllers in Melbourne received regular position updates as the Cessna crossed the coast near Cape Otway. Then, at 7:06 p.m, Valentich made a radio call that would become one of the most mysterious transmissions in Australian aviation history. "Melbourne, this is Delta Sierra Juliet. Is there any known traffic below 5,000? The controller responded that there was no known traffic in the area. A short pause followed. Then Valentich spoke again. "Seems to be a large aircraft below 5,000. Controllers asked him to confirm. He replied, It seems to be a long shape. It's moving fast, and it's playing some sort of game with me." From that moment, the exchange turned strange. Valentich described an object that didn't match any known aircraft profile. He said it approached from the east, passed over him at high speed and emitted a greenish light. "It's not an aircraft," he said. Controllers tried to make sense of the report. The radar at Melbourne was not picking up any secondary return besides Valentich's own transponder. No other aircraft were logged on that route. The controller asked him to describe the object in more detail. Valentich replied that it had a shiny metallic surface with a green light on it. "It seems to be stationary now," he said. "I'm orbiting around it, and it's just hovering, it's not an aircraft." At 7:09 p.m, the controller asked once more for the aircraft's position. Valentich replied that he was near Cape Otway, roughly 45 minutes into his flight. His voice now carried tension. "It's hovering and it's not an aircraft." Then came a sound, a metallic scraping noise lasting 17 seconds. After that, silence. Melbourne controllers continued calling him for the next few minutes. There was no reply. Radar contact was lost at 7:12 p.m. The final vector placed the Cessna somewhere over the Bass Strait, about 20 kilometres off the southern coast of Victoria. Search and rescue operations began within hours. The Royal Australian Air Force dispatched aircraft from East Sale and Laverton. Our Navy vessels patrolled the coastline. The next morning, A full-scale search was underway. The weather had changed overnight. Winds increased, and low cloud rolled in over the strait. For 7 days, aircraft and ships scoured the waters between Cape Otway and King Island. No wreckage, oil slicks, or floating debris were ever found. In the inquiry room at Melbourne, investigators reconstructed every detail of the flight. Valentich had logged 150 flight hours, not a veteran, but competent for the route he was flying. He was endorsed for night operations and had trained in instrument flight, though not yet certified. His aircraft was fully fueled, airworthy, and equipped with radio and transponder systems in working order. Investigators examined the possibility of disorientation. Flying over open water at dusk can be deceiving. The fading light, horizon haze, and scattered clouds can cause black hole illusion, where a pilot misjudges altitude and attitude. Valentich's fixation on an external light, whether a star, planet, or reflection, might have caused loss of situational awareness. The signal versus noise problem dominated the investigation. The final radio transmission contained interference, static, and the eerie metallic sound. Audio experts later studied the 17-second tape. Some suggested the noise was engine vibration captured through the open microphone. Others thought it could be propeller resonance during a steep descent. The recording revealed no indication of panic in Valentich's voice until the final seconds. One theory proposed that the pilot had become disoriented, entered a graveyard spiral, and crashed into the sea. At 4,500 feet, a small aircraft descending at high speed could have impacted within a minute, too quickly for recovery or further transmission. Another possibility was fuel exhaustion, though the aircraft had ample fuel for the planned route. Investigators ruled out mechanical failure. The Cessna's maintenance records were clean, and no distress call of engine trouble was made. Then there was the matter of the craft. Multiple witnesses around the coast reported seeing lights in the sky that evening. A plumber driving along the Great Ocean Road told police he had seen a green light moving erratically at roughly the same time Valentich went missing. A farmer near Apollo Bay reported similar lights hovering then accelerating fast. Yet these accounts were inconsistent in direction and altitude. Astronomers noted that Venus, Mars, and the star Antares were prominent in the twilight sky that night, all visible low on the horizon, bright enough to be mistaken for moving objects under certain conditions. The Royal Australian Air Force reviewed radar data from both Melbourne and King Island. Neither station detected any unidentified contact near the Cessna's position. The possibility that Valentich was shadowed by a military or civilian aircraft was ruled out. Still, the conversation remained haunting. "It's hovering and it's not an aircraft." Those were his last words before silence. The search grid expanded day by day. The Navy used sonar to scan the seabed, while aircraft flew low-level sweeps along the coast. The Bass Strait is shallow in parts, but marked by unpredictable currents and sandbanks that can conceal wreckage. Even small aircraft fragments could sink quickly under those conditions. Weeks later, a small piece of metal found washed ashore near Flinders Island was examined. It was confirmed to belong to a Cessna, but not definitively to VHTSJ. Other debris turned out to be unrelated fishing equipment. By December, the official search was called off. In the inquiry report filed the following year, investigators concluded that the aircraft was presumed lost at sea, and that the reason for the disappearance cannot be determined. The final vector placed it within a 30-mile radius south of Cape Otway. Audio engineers re-examined the final transmission years later. Some claimed the strange background noise sounded like metal scraping or oscillating tones. Others suggested it was simply the Cessna's engine running rough as fuel-starved air entered the intake. Speculation grew beyond technical analysis. Some writers linked Valentich's report to UFO sightings. Others dismissed it as disorientation and night illusion. Whatever the cause, the record of that last exchange remained factual and verified. Melbourne, this is Delta Sierra Juliet. Is there any known traffic below 5,000? No known traffic. There's a large aircraft below 5,000. It's not an aircraft. After that, the signal faded into static. 17 seconds of metallic noise and then nothing. The official logbook entry at Melbourne Air Traffic Control ends abruptly at 1912 hours, with a single notation written by the controller on duty. No further contact, presumed missing. The Cessna 182L VHTSJ with Frederick Valentich at the controls, was never found. The flight remains one of the most enigmatic disappearances in Australian aviation, a moment suspended between the last known signal and the noise that followed, somewhere over the cold, shifting waters of the Bass Strait. Argentine Air Force TC-48, Douglas C-54, 1965, Central America, Caribbean. On November 3, 1965, an Argentine Air Force Douglas C-54 Skymaster, tail number TC-48, took off from Howard Air Force Base in Panama. It was part of a 2-aircraft mission returning to Argentina after a training deployment in the United States. On board were 68 people, 9 crew members and 59 cadets from the Military Aviation School. Their destination that day was El Salvador, with a refueling stop planned at Managua, Nicaragua. The twin flight TC-43 took off minutes later under the same flight plan. The C-54 was a reliable 4-engine transport aircraft, the military version of the Douglas DC-4, used widely since World War II. The weather over Panama was good, with scattered clouds and light winds. At 5:49 a.m, the TC-48 crew checked in with air traffic control, reporting that everything was normal. The aircraft was cruising at 6,500 feet and following the prescribed route north along the Caribbean coast of Central America. Shortly after 6:30 a.m, the routine flight turned critical. The radio operator aboard TC-48 sent a message to the control tower in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. One of the engines had caught fire. The pilot, Major José Alberto de Marchi, reported shutting it down and said the crew would attempt to divert to Puerto Limón, Costa Rica, located on the Caribbean coast. Controllers acknowledged and cleared the aircraft for diversion. It was the last confirmed communication from TC-48. Within minutes, radio contact was lost. The companion aircraft, TC-43, tried to reach them but received no reply. Radar coverage in the region was minimal in 1965, leaving no clear record of the aircraft's trajectory after the distress call. 2 possible final vectors were drawn almost immediately. One line extended eastward over the Caribbean, suggesting the aircraft had continued over the sea before descending. The other veered southwest, crossing dense Costa Rican jungle near the border with Panama. Each theory pointed to vastly different search areas, one over open water, the other across mountainous rainforest, where visibility was near zero. In Buenos Aires, military command received word that contact had been lost with the cadet transport. The Argentine Air Force quickly organized a multinational search operation with assistance from Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and the United States. Within hours, US Navy patrol aircraft from the Panama Canal Zone joined the effort. At dawn the next day, search aircraft began flying grid patterns over the Caribbean. The sea was calm and visibility good. They reported spotting several oil slicks near the supposed route, but no floating wreckage or life rafts. Each sighting proved inconclusive. Meanwhile, ground searches were launched in Costa Rica. The terrain inland from the coast was some of the most challenging in Central America. Dense rainforest, steep ridges and swamps stretching for kilometers. Reports from local villagers in the Talamanca region mentioned hearing an explosion around the time of the disappearance. Others said they saw smoke rising in the mountains that morning. These accounts shifted the focus inland. In the inquiry room at the Argentine Embassy in San Jose, officers pinned large maps to the wall. Red string marked both hypotheses, the sea theory to the northeast and the jungle theory to the southwest. Daily search summaries filled the board, sightings, flight times, grid coordinates. As the days passed, frustration grew. Neither the jungle nor the sea yielded evidence. Meteorological data later showed that the region had experienced sudden tropical convection that morning. Thunderstorms formed rapidly along the coastal range, generating downdrafts and turbulence. For a fully loaded C-54 with one engine out, climbing or maintaining altitude in those conditions would have been extremely difficult. The terrain west of Puerto Limón rises sharply, with peaks over 7,000 feet, high enough to block a low-altitude aircraft caught in cloud. By November the 6th, 3 days after the disappearance, the search area expanded to over 25,000 square kilometers. Argentina sent its own aircraft to join the hunt, along with 1,000 personnel from local authorities. Helicopters attempted to reach suspected crash sites deep in the forest, but constant rain, fog and lack of landing zones made progress slow. The inquiry turned its attention to the final radio message. Engine on fire, diverting to Lyman. The tone had been calm, not the kind of distress signal that suggests immediate catastrophe. That fact puzzled investigators. If the fire had been brought under control, the crew could have reached the coast. But if it had spread, or if the fire had damaged control cables or fuel lines, the aircraft could have lost stability within minutes. Engineers examined possible mechanical causes. The C-54's Pratt & Whitney R2000 engines were known to develop oil leaks that could lead to fires if not detected early. Maintenance logs from Panama showed that TC-48 had received repairs days earlier, though nothing suggesting a major issue. The investigation also considered the possibility of electrical failure, which could have disrupted communication before impact. The inquiry team also received a message from a ship, the SS Gulf King, reporting that it had sighted smoke and debris on the water, roughly 90 miles northeast of Puerto Limón on the morning of the incident. Navy vessels were sent to check the coordinates, but strong currents and limited daylight prevented confirmation. For months, search efforts continued on both fronts, sea and jungle. Small expeditions combed the Talamanca Mountains, while naval patrols traced the Caribbean coastline from Honduras to Panama. Every lead ended in dead ends. In January 1966, the official search was suspended. The Argentine Air Force declared the crew and cadets missing, presumed dead. The loss was one of the largest in the service's history. But the mystery refused to fade. Local farmers and hunters in Costa Rica continued to report sightings of metallic debris in remote forested areas. Several claimed to have found twisted metal pieces or burned fabric in ravines, but when authorities arrived, the evidence had vanished or could not be verified. In 1967, 2 years after the disappearance, a Costa Rican expedition led by journalist and explorer Claudio Salas ventured deep into the Talamanca Range, guided by indigenous Cabicar communities. They found traces of aluminum and fragments of wiring near a riverbed. Samples were collected and sent to Buenos Aires for testing, but results were inconclusive. Through the 1970s and 1980s, new expeditions set out almost yearly, each hoping to find what the official investigation could not. In 1989, one group claimed to have located a debris field deep in the jungle near the Rio Larry, consistent with a large aircraft impact. Photographs were taken but never verified by authorities. When another team revisited the site years later, dense vegetation had reclaimed the area. Satellite analysis in the 1990s offered little improvement. The canopy in the Talamanca Mountains is among the thickest on the continent, capable of concealing wreckage even meters from the surface. The sea theory also persisted. Oceanographers noted that if the aircraft had ditched offshore, strong Caribbean currents could have carried debris far from the initial crash site within days. With no deep-sea recovery technology available at the time, the wreck could have settled beyond reach on the seafloor. In Buenos Aires, families of the cadets pushed for renewed searches. They argued that the official inquiry had been divided between too many theories, splitting resources and leaving both possible crash zones incompletely explored. Their calls led to several small joint missions with Costa Rican authorities in the 2000s, but none found definitive evidence. In recent years, modern expeditions using drones and LiDAR have scanned parts of the Talamanca region. Some images have shown possible metallic reflections, though dense foliage prevents clear identification. The final report of the Argentine Air Force remains unchanged. TC-48 departed Panama at 5:49 a.m. on November 3, 1965. At 6:30 it reported an engine fire and intention to divert to Puerto Limón. Contact was lost moments later. No wreckage or human remains have ever been recovered. In the flight log preserved in Buenos Aires, the last entry reads 0632, engine fire reported 0634, diverting to Lyman. No further communication. On the map, the red circle marks the area where the aircraft might have gone down, half in the Caribbean Sea, half over Costa Rica's southern jungle. Between those two worlds, the TC-48 and its 68 occupants vanished, leaving behind nothing but two coordinates and a question that neither ocean nor forest has ever answered. Decades of searching, sonar scans, and satellite images have filled reports, but not the empty skies they left behind. What remains are voices fading in static, lost bearings, and unfinished journeys, reminders that even in the age of flight, some paths still lead into silence.